and audio.
Okay.
It'll videotape him, actually?
No, it has what's on the screen, and then you can hear the audio.
Oh, great.
So it's that one. Okay. So anyway, I was studying a version of physics and a metaphysic probably as long as 7 or 8 years ago, when I was still kind of going through the educational process of my own, and as I began to kind of undertake and figure out what I was going to do for a career. And I became very disillusioned with some of the explanations that I had been given in the programs that I was in, and I kind of stumbled upon some things as I went along that some of it that made no sense whatsoever, and some of it that made a ton of sense. And what I figured out is that if you don't go backwards in time and figure out really what the context for these principles that underpin these technical processes that we now use and employ as a technology, you don't really understand them. And for me, to jump in the middle of something like naturopathy or homeopathy, to just sort of enter into it without understanding truly the history and philosophy of the concepts that underpinned it, I'm not really all that great at that. I have to have very, very good grasp of context to feel comfortable before I start to apply them. And so for the concepts in homeopathy and self-similarity and vitalism, in terms of homeopathy being built upon simulum and potentization, which is my interpretation of an infinitesimal, and then the dynamic. So this is just kind of my disclaimer. So I am a huge fan of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and this disclaimer says, basically for me, the way that I read this is that I don't know. And what I'm very much tired of doing is talking about things that I don't know about. And to some degree, when you take and you go through a typical sequence, taking classes in sciences and physics and biology and chemistry, you very much, the last sentence there, and rummage in empty worlds no more, because I very much believe that the current concepts upon which biology specifically is built, and in turn the physics and metaphysics that biology is built upon, are very much empty, rummaging around in emptiness. There's nothing there, and there's nothing to be made from it, and I'm very tired of doing that. And so that's my disclaimer. I don't know, and I'm trying to figure that out. So if by chance I do stumble on these innermost forces, God help us. So here's a little presentation outline. So I'm going to talk about my method and what I did know about it when I started kind of this way of thinking, and what I didn't know about it and how I came to understand it a little bit better. And I'm going to talk about analogy. I'm going to talk about history. I'm going to talk about a mathematical concept called topology and how those things apply to a language. And we're going to go way back in time. And some of this might get way out in left field for some of us. But nonetheless, that's what we're going to do. I'm going to cover a little historical context of self-similarity. So I should say, I originally intended to do dynamics and self-similarity, but what I figured out when going back through my notes and my own reading on the subject is that this is so big that I'm probably just going to do self-similarity as one first and try to keep that sort of organized in one location. But really, self-similarity is a reference to dynamics. It's that point from which dynamics would emanate. So we're going to cover the Antediluvian period, which is just a rough translation to that is anything that precedes what we would consider the history of, or the time period of the biblical flood. We're going to cover some concepts that involve Tibet and Sumeria and Babylon. And we're going to cover this concept of self-similarity as it occurs both in their architecture and in some of their texts. We're going to do the same thing in the Orient, so we're going to unpack what the yin and yang symbol actually means, in my opinion. We're going to do the same thing with Greco-Roman Hellenism in a little lesser way, because as we move into Greece, these concepts start to change. They start to become altered by analogy, even though there is still a preservation or a self-similum in the concepts from the older period. They begin to change, and then as you move forward into Aristotle, then you start seeing how they become sort of translated into total loss of the essence of the concept itself, which, in my opinion, was done on purpose. And then we'll talk a little bit about what I call the impetus, and that is a reference back to language, so that this is actually a force in and of itself that has guided and produced a certain order and, in a Christian sense, a logos upon the entirety of each culture, which is an analogy for both cultures that have come before it and in some sense cultures that have constellated it. And we'll talk about some modern definitions of what we're talking about in self-similarity, which would be the mathematical idea of recursion and fractality. And there's many things that you could talk about, or many different words that you could use synonymously with fractality and mathematical recursion. And then some implications. So at the very end, I just want to touch on, so it's like the implications for me is that we have to move beyond, and this is the really important part for me. This technically is not my work. This is a synthesis of a whole bunch of historical research, philosophical research, on and on and on that I have been doing, but it really is not my own. There are other people throughout history who have explored this in great depth. My personal interest is the unification of a plasma biophysics with this idea, and then of course homeopathy just kind of plops out of that. It's just there. And that's what I want to do. And the first problem that we have to get at is moving beyond this field concept as a convenient metaphor, because when you explore the history of the conceptualization of an electromagnetic field, or a field in any general sense, the Russians talked about it like as in actually the field that you plow, but their idea and the way that they use it linguistically was precisely the same that we would now sort of use as a contextual electromagnetic field concept. It was no different. And then eventually we move into manifolds and multiplicities. And really ultimately at the base of biology, what you find is that as you zoom out, not only is the water in a living state in a lattice structure a fractal, not only is the DNA geometrically a fractal, but as you zoom out at every scale of life, all the way out to the universal level, you're dealing with this idea of recursion at every single level. And it's that then which homeopathy is built upon in similum. And it's that medical paradigm that obviously makes the most sense if we're to talk about this as natural.
Recursion, you define that? I have no idea.
Recursion is exactly the same thing with a little less flair as fractality. So mathematical recursion simply means that some mathematical relationship within any substructure at any scale just recurs over and over and over, exactly. Just like the Mandelbrot set, that famous, is exactly what it is. Recursion really was just another way to talk about it. But I think with this, and this is the point with some of this, is that as you change context and change languages, you lose that essence. Because I like the idea of a fractal and the definition of a fractal because it has provisions in it for a living system, whereas recursion really gets very binary coded. You start
from the word recur, so it keeps recurring, that pattern keeps recurring.
Right, and so then you get this idea of just a Cartesian number line, where with a fractal you actually have a form that goes along with it that you can see as it evolves and moves and looks like it's alive. And I just think that it's important to keep that essence, because I do think that there is a formalism by which life can be described, and I think that we'll touch on some of that stuff today too. So, sorry, I have to keep opening up my surface here. Okay. So, I hope that this doesn't get too word salad. I have a kind of a bad habit of making things maybe more convoluted than they need to be. But I'd like to say that my thesis today is that it's kind of twofold. One is that we're all creatures of history, and that these concepts are no doubt the product of a history of conceptual development that has is very rich and very old. And I think I'll show maybe that it's older than some of us imagine. So the purpose of the presentation is to lay a foundation, which I mentioned, for a further analysis maybe of an embryonic structure of what the pre-homeopathic concepts of self-similarity, which is described in the metaphysical concept of embryogenesis, which we will get to, the function of any metaphorical primitive, so the metaphorical primitive here being self-similarity, is a self-consistent framework from which an ontology can arise and emerge, and then a physic can arise and emerge. And without that, you don't really have anything. You can't just start in the center and work outwards. You have to have something that includes all concepts and is relatable by all concepts through analogy. You have to view things in terms of what is preserved as opposed necessarily to what is different. So, where is it here? So the ontological framework necessarily precedes any attempt to parse out a phenomenology in a physics, which is what I said. In other words, the physics emerges from a wider metaphysical context. Subsequent formalisms, being math, grammar, and linguistics, these kinds of things also emerge from this. And then they, by analogy, refer to the greater, the wider metaphysic. which can be refined and applied with greater accuracy. So I think that that's one thing we would all agree in homeopathy that might be missing just a little bit is parity in the formal language about which we all talk about certain things. At some point, we all have to stop inventing our own pet theories, and we have to become, there has to be this unity. And in this metaphysical system contains that very deep embodiment of an infinitely fine substructure that is at its base a unity from which a unified language would emerge. And I think this fairly sums up the situation. Kind of the two concepts that we're going to focus mostly here on today are axiomatic in homeopathy, and they're axiomatic in this system, and it's very ancient. And so then understanding that there isn't really a provision for a unity principle in any mainstream of physics. I mean, they kind of, out of one side of their mouth, talk about quantum foam, or even the, the older concepts of the electrodynamic ether are still a little bit lacking because they're really difficult to define. And I'm just kind of getting, what I go on to say here is I'm getting a little tired of listening to even the proponents of homeopathy drag out and kind of almost, this is a little vulgar, but bastardize some of these physical concepts that they just sort of throw in front of themselves to conveniently describe things that are really very abstract. But ultimately, you can't have a non-reductionist argument, either whether you're going into a particle interpretation of physics or whether you're going into a field interpretation of physics. It really makes no difference. In my view, it does not matter if you're reducing everything to fields or particles. It's still a reductionist argument, and so there has to be some unification of the two. And so I would include some of these theory, biophoton theory, and anything involving a modern conceptualization of an electron or a physical interpretation of the atom. Interference theory is another good one, which is kind of where the opera singer breaking the glass comes from. And so then another point I'd like to touch on too here before we get too far into it is that I think that this is precisely my issue. And I know Dr. Fiore is very interested in the nano-pharmacological description, because I think from a pragmatic standpoint, it is absolutely the way that we would be able to get homeopathy on some level recognized in a empirical scientific way. The problem is that when you start referencing the pharmacological paradigm, you leave yourself open to subversion and being co-opted by the pharmaceutical companies themselves, which are more or less Satan in this story. So I don't really think that that's necessarily a good idea, or at the very least, there has to be some way to differentiate, parse out the nature of homeopathy in an energetic context that's rational, that's non-dual, and that does not necessarily involve the traditional language of pharmacodynamics, because again, I think that that is a trap. I think that that's a trap to fall into, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong. I just think that even just through the language, because that's a very important part of this, you would allow for very talented people in the PR industry of pharmaceuticals and marketing to just co-opt this, and I think that that's not where we want to go with it. We are drawing distinctions between ourselves and the drug pushers, not analogies. Okay, so that's a little outline there, and so how did I come to this, and I was doing this without really knowing what I was doing. So when I first kind of started investigating some of these subjects, I naturally knew that biology, eventually I figured out that I thought biology and the concepts that underpin it were wrong physically, and that then you start working back into physics from biophysics, and then eventually you start working into philosophy, and then into theology, and then into these crazy metaphysical systems. But I kept seeing recurrence, and I kept seeing things pop up over and over again that were very similar. And I wondered to myself, what in the world is this? And I had never taken a class on linguistics. I knew nothing about it. I knew nothing about Noam Chomsky. I knew nothing about Bernstein at this time. But what I found is that when I investigated what an analogy was, that's what my brain was doing just kind of naturally, is that I was parsing through, as I changed context to context, I was preserving certain elements in my reading and my understanding, and then I was making that connection as I would go into two totally different paradigms, and kind of unifying this whole kind of set of ideas. And so that's kind of was my emergence in understanding my own preference for being more of an autodidact than to sit through school and lectures. And for anybody, I put this in here, for anybody who knows me and has ever discussed the subjects like this one before with me, and some maybe not in this room have, maybe not. It's very common to hear me say something like, eventually you realize that what you are reading, all of these people are saying the same thing on some level. I just couldn't, it was stunning me over and over and over again as I was reading things that were written thousands of years apart saying the same thing. So that's kind of a broken record, and it's an extreme oversimplification, but what an analogy is, in my definition, is the recognition of some common element between contexts and the identification of common structures existing in all paradigms. In this way, we mean to begin with cultural analogies throughout ancient and near history, which satisfy the criteria of self-similarity, which I define in an analogous way. Upon examination of key historical portions of the nature of dynamics and similarity, history revolves around this idea based upon analogy, and by definition we mean to say that as one moves between these common elements, that you can then reduce these similarities of the self to a symbolic notation of itself. And so instead of you're taking, instead of this linear idea where you have one thing naturally progressing in a linear fashion from another, and we're all familiar with the concept of nonlinear systems, but we don't really realize how old that is, and that these groups of individuals had formal notation to deal with this analogical relationship between what in philosophy we would call the question of the one and the many and everything that comes from, or what is more modernly called now manifolds and multiplicities. So that formalization of language, where you're actually dealing with the formalization of linguistic concepts and their meaning as opposed to quantities themselves, and you ask yourself, and how in the world do you deal with mathematics without numbers? But that's what Chomsky did. So Noam Chomsky is one very important character in all of this, and actually Leonard Bernstein drew on him. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the topology as it relates. So what is a topology? So what's this? So how does this relate? Okay, well, what a topology is in a very mathematical way as opposed to a linguistic way. A topology takes any manifold or any structure that has been constructed under self-similar conditions that more or less exists in this this physical or volumetric relationship within itself, and you take it and you deform it in any way that you want, so that you could cleave it, you could twist it, you could expose it to tensions, but and as you do this, you like, let's say that you were to take the cleaving analogy, which is the one we're going to use, you still retain the commonality of the whole. It doesn't matter how many times you divide it out, you still are retaining an analogical reference to the overall unity. And it's from this that we will have our relationship between math and language. So what Leonard Bernstein did, a man named Joseph P. Farrell has written a ton of books on this subject, and one of the things that he referenced, and this was very early on, that I was actually listening to like YouTube lectures on it between my commute back and forth to work. And what I found out was that he had gotten some of his ideas from this 1972 set of lectures. Leonard Bernstein was a very well-known musician, and he gave some discourse at Harvard for about, I think it was like 7 lectures, and he titled them Unanswered Questions, and they're all available for free online at opencultures.com. And he called them the Norton Lectures. And what Leonard was doing is Leonard Bernstein was drawing analogies between music and physics and poetry and linguistics, and he was basically drawing, his big impetus was to show that there was parity between the arts and between these people who had sort of taken over academia and begun to devalue music and philosophy and the humanities. And these people were, of course, the physicists. And this is just the way that materialism, positivism, and all these different kinds of ideologies that don't really have provisions for them for things like, I don't know, empathy, compassion, bedside manner, those kinds of qualities. There's no provision for that necessarily in physics. So Bernstein said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tear apart your language, and I'm going to show that you and I are doing the same thing. You're doing art, I'm doing art, and you can't draw any differentiation between them. That is to say, physics doesn't get to divorce itself from the art and the philosophy from whence it came. And he did, and he creamed them, and it was great. So after listening to those lectures and then working on Farrell's work and trying to grasp what exactly they were saying, eventually I realized that oh, well, I had kind of had this premonition of my own in my own life. It's like, why do I keep seeing the same stuff come up over again? Well, these are from these sources I was able to kind of find my own my own thinking. You also find these things ancient, this topology or this analogy actually, of all places, in Orthodox Christianity, and St. Basil the Great and St. Gregory the theologian both speak of these things too. So we're not leaving out the church here at all. This is not, the purpose here is to unify all schools of philosophy with theology and physics. The purpose is to understand that in ancient times they were unified, they talked about them the same way, and relatively the symbolic notation that underpinned them at any given time could be more or less an analogy for one and the other. They weren't talking about different things. It's just that it's only been in modern times, since the Enlightenment specifically, have we driven this wedge between the languages and completely separated them out, and there, we've got polarization.
The priests used to be the physicists, the scientists, the doctors. It was all one role.
Absolutely,
it's the same thing.
Absolutely, and that when you have this, when you start cleaving things unnaturally, let's say, you start cleaving things unnaturally, you leave voids that basically authoritarians can fill. And what they've noticed throughout history, and you can study this in any tyrannical situation throughout history, as old as you want to go, that void is always filled by the installation of some group of experts. It doesn't matter if we want to talk about them as physicists or chemists or the doctors in the hospital or anything else, or the AMA or whomever. That's precisely. So then the duty of any individual who is an authoritarian is just to start drawing lines where they don't belong. It sounds very simple. And that becomes kind of the primary philosophy of the control feature. So a topology then in mathematics, to give it a formal definition. So in mathematics, geometric topology is the study of manifolds and maps between them. So it's not just the study as if you were to have this unity and you cleave it, you understand that you have one side, two sides, both related by analogy both to each other and the unity, but then you have a common surface, and that's where topology comes in. So you have this common surface that exists between the two of them, which is itself also considered an infinite. And when you're dealing with an infinite unity, and you're dealing with the what's called the boundless or the ineffable, and the actual cleaving portion of it, and then the two sides, you're dealing with infinities in such a way that they're already kind of quasi-mathematical. And so now then you have the ability to start establishing a notation for them. The analogical similarities between the three surfaces in topology, these elements are then preserved in the system as you move now. So as you make the equations and the notation more complex, all of the original analogous portions of the original unity are preserved. And then, so you see, then this is what we're doing with analogy, and then topology is more or less drawing an equivalence between the two, and of course then math and language could be the same thing. And we'll touch on some modern, there's really good, like Kurt Gödel did some wonderful work on this. He basically drove Bertrand Russell to the point of insanity, one equation. So, okay, so we're going to go on to the Antediluvian period. Now, most people basically in modern anthropology and archaeology more or less presume that this period does not exist. In fact, most of the popular representations of history for us, we're monkeys. We walked out of, neo-Darwinism, we walked out of Africa 100,000 years ago, and we've been progressing more or less in this linear way to our current modern humanoid form in that amount of time. Actually, I think it was 1 million years ago, but I mean 100,000 years is right around, give or take, where they say that modern humans kind of emerged. Not in the Hermetic schools. This is not the way that they see it. The Hermetic schools, and in particular, they weren't even really Hermetic schools in that time, but if you move through the texts that were written by the Vedas and by the Egyptians and by the Babylonians and by the Sumerians, they all have creation epochs that more or less establish that their understanding of their creation was that they are the legacy of a higher civilization that fell a very long time ago. Now, you're probably all familiar with the pop references, things like Atlantis and all this kind of different stuff. But that really is what they say. That's what they say about themselves. You also find this in the Maya. You also find this in the Polynesian. You also find this referenced in the Nag Hammadi, which is a Gnostic text. You also find this then in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And essentially, you find this idea that is basically unified across ancient civilizations. And so that analogy then made me very curious. So in the Antediluvian period, the text that I'm going to reference is called the Corpus Hermeticum, and there are several. That's actually the sort of the substructure of a set of texts that came from what were known as the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, or Tahuti, depending on who you ask. And the metaphysical concept that underpins them is as above, so below, and I think that now we have been introduced to self-similarity and recursion. That is self-similarity. That is to say that at any scale, macrocosm to microcosm, you're more or less dealing with the same thing. So all throughout these Hermetic schools, from ancient Sumeria, which is 6,000, 7,000 DC, let's say, and the Babylonians, Mesopotamia, so-called cradle of civilization, this is the rule that goes all the way through them. There is very, very little disagreement until you get to Greece. That's where it starts to become kind of changed into something else. So I'm going to read a little bit about that. So what I have here, the Greeks who conquered Egypt had good reason to identify with the Egyptian Thoth, with their own Hermes. Thoth was the quintessential wisdom god, or if one prefers, the god who imparted the high sciences of divination, that is to say, astrology, astronomy, magic, and medicine. Similarly, the Greek Hermes was the wisdom god who crossed the border between the gods and men. So there's this constant recurring theme of this idea of a higher or set of transcendental forces. Some of them talk about them as gods, some of them talk about them in other ways, but moreover, what you see is that there's always this transcendental principle, and that transcendental principle is unified by analogy through the immanent principles that emerge as culture and phenomenologically emerge as culture, buildings, architecture, people, language. It's the same thing over and over. So Hermeticism was used as a common surface or boundary condition between the worlds. It's very important. So remember we talked about in topology and the cleaving and studying the common boundary between two infinite structures that are analogously related. And of course, the Greek Hermes was the inventor of oratory and letters. So now we have this relationship, their myth, everything contains all of these concepts. We have topology, we have language, we have recursion, we have a subset of transcendental forces, and we have this individual or this deity who is responsible for creating language, medicine, and wisdom. It's all included in one. This, of course, led to a conflation of the functions of the two gods as they amalgamated into the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes. He was the god who lived among men and taught philosophy, theology, and eventually inspiring. So the tradition ran the philosophers Democritus, Plato, and Pythagoras. In other words, the Hermetic tradition claimed that it was Egypt and not Greece that was the origin of the philosophy itself. It was precisely this conflation that led very early on to confusion over the author of the Hermetica. As early as the 3rd century BC, the Egyptian priest Manetho stated that there were in fact 2 Hermes. So this is another really important point to stop and talk about. So if there are 2 people who were claiming themselves to be Hermes, in their conceptualization, this does not mean that there were 2 Hermes. In the Greek conception of this means, and we'll get into the monad, the dyad, the triad, this means that from one unity came 2. It's a symbolic reference to one unity becoming 2. And it's just important to keep pointing out this recursion and this fractality of their language. The language itself is a fractal. The carrier frequencies that actually exist from emanating from the voice box as people say it actually could be considered a recursive process. The narratives are a recursive process. They gave rise to recursive processes in architecture and culture, and it's just the whole thing is just fractalized, the whole thing. Let's see. So in this, it would have claimed that the 2 Hermes goes back to antediluvian knowledge. That is, the Hermetic text contains ancient wisdom, a primordial theology, or a Prisca theology, or a Prisca sapientia, as it's called sometimes. And this was to play a crucial role in wide dissemination and the influence of the Hermetica up until the late Renaissance. For example, Herodotus records that Pythagoras sojourned in Egypt and returned to Greece and taught the Greeks philosophy and the mysteries. By the 9th century, the Muslim scholars Al-Bazar noted that the first Hermes, whom the Egyptians identified as Tahuti, was the grandson of Adam, and reckoned by the Hebrews to be Enoch, and whom the Muslims followed to be in the tradition of the Quran, took this to be an ancient prophet Idris. So he, according to Al-Bazar, erected cities and pyramids in Egypt and warned of an impending flood, taking the precaution to inscribe all of this knowledge in the walls of the temple at Akhmet. So basically what these people are saying is that, first of all, Christianity and the myths of Christianity, Islam are unified. Secondly, they came from a higher tradition that was wiped out by a geographic cataclysm, which is essentially, again, a universal constant in all of the creation epics of all cultures. They all posit a flood. It doesn't matter who you get. From the Hopi, you could talk about essentially any Native American tribe in the West, through Greece, through Egypt, they all talk about this great cataclysm that caused kind of a rearrangement of the Earth's surface and a rearrangement of the peoples on the Earth's surface, and that's kind of where we are today. And so now I'm going to get a little more. So this is kind of what I wanted to show with that was that there's this constant thread running through this idea of a primordial civilization, whatever it was. And if you really want to get further into it, if you want more than just kind of a documentation in a patristic sense, or to look at anything that's really no more than a philosophical representation, then what I would do is I would go take a look at the work of Michael Cremo, who wrote a book called Forbidden Archaeology. It's very, very good. He is a professional archaeologist, and he takes you through an absolute, it's like Alice in Wonderland, through an examination of archaeology of not only the anomalies, but just things that just simply can't be explained through the modern kind of chronological setting within which we are placed in a historical context. What? Michael Cremo, Forbidden Archaeology. Another very good book on this subject is written by a man named Robert Sephyr, who it's S-E-P-H-Y-R. He has done a ton of work on the Sphinx and the Giza Plateau, and basically has come to the conclusion that these are significantly older than what we call, either pre-dynastic Egypt, and that they do show a lot of the structures actually show ancient damage of high water markings for a flooding. And the third source would be, it's just a website, but she does very, very good work. She's a Slavic woman. But she did not do like a PhD in archaeology or anything like that. But she runs a website called megaliths.org, and she will take you basically on every corner of the planet and show you this recursion and that exists in the architecture specifically, and the mathematical relationships of the fractality upon which these people built their structures. They not only structured the buildings that way, they also set up the entire city that way. And there's all kinds of research that is done on the idea of recursion and fractality in the Mayan cities, Teotihuacan, and then the cities that exist there in Bolivia. But they set their entire culture up on this. So there was, at some point, the point is that we're coming from some kind of unified geometric understanding that provided them with the ability to build these megalithic structures that, quite frankly, we can't duplicate today. It's that simple. For precision or size or any of that kind of stuff, not to mention the potential function that these things may have had in terms of the Giza pyramids, and there's all kinds of stuff on that too. We won't get into that. It's kind of another question, but I mean, it's one interesting thing to note, because you get a lot of people who are like, well, they just carved these rocks out of stone. They didn't. So the blocks which compose the Giza Plateau that build the Khufu Pyramid and the Great Pyramid of Giza are a geopolymer of some kind. There's no known kind of natural substance that, in other words, it contains that particular constitution in those specific ratios. They introduced high amounts volumetrically of quartz into this rock. It's almost as if it were poured into molds in some way. And it makes it extremely, what's called piezoelectrically active. So this thing very well could have been some sort of electrical device. There's just no way to tell. But if you want to explore that, there's a man named Christopher Dunn, who is a professional engineer who got a very good analysis on the pyramid from just an engineering standpoint. And then Farrell, who I mentioned before, Joseph P. Farrell, did very good work on that too. So let's get into the topological part of this metaphor and kind of unpack what I'm talking about. So we're now at last in a position to examine some of the concepts here we've been referring to in the Hermetica, namely self-similarity and how they're expressed in this ancient metaphor. So what we're going to do is we're going to pretend, if you take this square as our example, and so we're going to use the idea that I mentioned before of a cleaving, and we're going to, so basically what you're doing is you're formulating a distinction of any kind. So it's the first distinction. It's the first kind of, in a way, differentiation. And you have to imagine that primordial time existed, or whether you want to call it God or whatever. These people's ancient idea, conceptualization of metaphysics, that you existed in an infinite sea of sameness, and in that there is no distinction to be made. So from that, then you're dealing with kind of a nothing, and from this you get a lot of the references, and a lot of this, especially in some of the Jewish mysticism and the Kabbalah, you get a lot of this references to this Ein Sof, or this chaotic nothingness kind of force. That's not a nothing in the sense that there's nothing there. It's a nothing in the sense that there can be no distinction. In other words, if you can't make a relation between one thing and another, you can't draw a distinction between it, and therefore you can't really have an object. So it's just sameness, infinite sameness. And now we imagine if this, that it has been cleaved. Or one thing that I want to say too is that it's very important to distinguish between nothing and no thing. That's maybe one of the most important concepts to grasp in this way of thinking, is that there's a nothingness, which isn't actually a nothingness, and there's no thing. And that's a big, very, very important. So here you have your infinitely extended thing, which, as we noted, has a perfect mathematically empty symbol. Now you don't have to necessarily use a straight line to cleave. We're going to imagine that we're going to use this kind of what they refer to as a hyperset, and we would symbolize this by drawing a line through that circle. In other words, now you have the infinite, boundless, ineffable, whatever you want to call it, your infinite portion. Remember, this box doesn't actually have boundaries. It's just a way to represent the infinite sameness. And you make your cleave. So now you have your differentiation. You have a circle and a square. And now you have to start thinking about, at this point, you realize where some of the ancient conceptualizations, why they put so much emphasis on things like squaring the circle and these very simple forms in geometry, especially platonic geometry, because this is what they were getting at. They were trying to develop a formal notation for their metaphysics. So in other words, we have two spaces, all that inside the circle and all that outside of it. Or in other words, we have what a man named Spencer Brown calls a cloven space. Note that the circle is a circumscription, or a writing around. So it's a paragraphing of sorts. In other words, the original idea of a paragraph was to encompass your ideas and to make distinctions. And so you notice the little formal paragraph symbol that they used to use in the computers, or where you can go. But so when you indent a paragraph, what you are doing, it literally is making a distinction linguistically between this and that. And that's precisely what they're utilizing here, as the same idea. So two important things. We are dealing with a space in the intellectual or conceptual sense, and with a space in the real physics sense, at one and the same time. So these people weren't just talking about the original box as being God, but they were dealing with that as an actual space as well. And this is the way that they transferred that ineffable into something that they could deal with. And additionally, because our original box is an infinite, the circle or cloven space within it by itself has no limits. Because if you draw a line inside of something infinite, that line could perceivably go on forever. A surface, as topologists would say, between it and the space outside it. So we may assign symbols or marks to each of the three things as now being distinguished. Now we have the big box, we have the circle within it, and we have the distinction itself. And so then the notation that they come up with looks, this is horrible resolution, I'm sorry, but so this is the original point of the differential. And now that you probably are familiar with the complex differential symbol. This is the way in calculus that we eventually had to formulate to deal with more than three elements in motion at one time, because you can't, that's the problem with the electron, really, is that it's called there's a famous problem called the three-body problem, where it becomes so statistically, basically you get an undefined answer with speed and position. Let's see where I'm at here. So the space outside the circle we will designate as the interior of space 1, and is denoted by the topological 0 superscript, or in the slash, or the phi symbol, too, depending. And number 2, the space similarity inside the C circle is space, or it's another interior, and then the common surface between the two. So 1 and 2, it's a unification. Notice what we have now done as a result of performing one act we have three distinctions. And we have created a metaphor of a 1-3 metaphor of a kind of primordial trinity. So that's another very important symbolic point, is that this emanation of this trinity not only pervades all of these ancient cultures, but of course we know the trinity to be, in our near time period, to be associated with Christianity. There really is no distinction in the metaphysical reality of Orthodox Christianity in this sense and Egyptian cosmology and Vedic cosmology as you go back. There's no distinction whatsoever. This is precisely how they design their metaphysical systems. And so all of this hubbub about Hermeticism being heresy and physics not being able to deal with Christianity, it's absolute garbage because they're built precisely on the same principle. Notably, because our original distinction, or the dimension or the infinite, we cannot assign any real dimensionality to that, so no quantification. You can't, it's not a coordinate system, in other words. It will always remain the same formal description. So this is what I was talking about with preserving the unity. No matter how many distinctions you would make in this system, you're always still preserving the same analogical unity. So now let us use this very abstract, what's called, what Farrell called the topological metaphor of the medium, to examine its expression in very ancient cultures and the ancient mind, which we've kind of already talked about. So the one thing that I'm going to do, if it's okay, is I'm just going to show why that system, which is the basis of Egyptian cosmology, is the basis of the Trinity, and Christian cosmology, Zoroastrianism, Gnosticism, all of these very interrelated, they all have precisely the same. And this is what I referred to earlier as embryogenesis of a concept. So this is the way that they developed developed linguistically the idea of this concept and then turned it into a formal notation. And this is what I believe why Egyptian hieroglyphs and symbolic notation of the ancient languages, they didn't write in discrete words because they understood implicitly that they had to deal with both the ineffable and the physical part of it in one symbol and to universalize that. And they had to bring, which the English language or many other can't do. So in the Vedic texts, it looks like this. So their trinity is Brahma, Shiva, Vishnu, or Hindu. I mean, it's still, a lot of that is still, has been retained. So without a doubt, the earliest expression of this metaphor exists in the Vedic traditions of ancient India. For example, the Padma Purana, it says, in the Padma Purana, it says this: in the beginning of creation, the great Vishnu, desirous of creating the whole world, became threefold: creator, preserver, and destroyer. In order to create this world, the Supreme Spirit produced from the right side of his body himself as Brahman. Then, in order to preserve the world, he produced from his left side Vishnu. And so from one side, Brahma becomes our original big box, and Vishnu becomes the distinction between the two, and that's how you get the world, or the material portion of the world. And there are several significant things going on in this passage. First, note that the metaphor, once again, Vishnu, self-differentiating into three entities. But secondly, notice the persons of Vishnu, Brahma, Shiva are associated with the functions that they perform. So not only do you have just the thing in itself in terms of being distinct, Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu being distinct, but they also have specific functionalities which are differentiated from themselves. So that's kind of a description. So you're probably saying, okay, well, what's this got to do with homeopathy, frankly? And the idea is that to form a basis of physics for homeopathy to be based upon, it must be self-consistent with a metaphysic that is sort of like this. And working backwards through particle physics and all of these different kinds of physical paradigms that mostly emanate from this idea of black holes and the Big Bang and mathematical singularities are more or less totally incompatible with not only the biology that we study even at a molecular level, but also with homeopathy. And it's kind of really about framing homeopathy as being the ideas behind homeopathy, or the ideas behind the simulum as the most fundamental. And the only thing that could cure then is the most fundamental. That unity is the only, and that's the reason I would say that homeopathy is really the only curative approach. It's not palliative, it's not suppressive. Those two things would be more associated with a destruction, where homeopathy is really just an analogy for this wider metaphysical context that is hugely old. So We read some about the Corpus Hermeticum, and we see this is the book, one of the books that I utilized in the subject. Also, you could read the three-volume works by Cornelius Agrippa on Hermeticism, which is pretty good. So this is a Tibetan. This is really just an idea of a fractal. This is the Tibetan art of mandala, where they literally are placing a single grain of sand at thousands and thousands of hours, going to this idea of recursion, and then you have your unities and your divisiveness, and from that you have then something that looks more like a human structure or a temple, or otherwise you get the unity, you get the world. And this is the way that they talk about it, and especially the, not the evil branches of Tibetan Buddhism, which there are. And there's also one of my favorite poets is a man named William Blake, and he says, "To see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour." And this is, to me, I interpret that to be driving at this concept explicitly. So this is a Vedic or a Hindu temple, and you can, I mean, right off the bat, what do you see? You see them building their architecture based upon recursive structure, without a doubt. And there are, I don't know how many examples of this in that particular vein. So somebody at one time had this as a high portion of their culture. There's another one.
You're saying recursive, self-similar.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely, yep. And so that it's that self-similarity, or that idea of similum, that these things from which are similar actually produce a unity again, which I think that it's a good way of looking at a human being in a state of vitality or a state of health, is as a unity. In other words, you do not have all of these substances that are decohering in a dissipative chemistry sense, that are decohering or creating entropy or moving you away from, or further away from, or I'm sorry, further towards kind of an equilibrium process. You're actually, that this dissipative construct in a chemical sense is actually produced when you surround yourself with this specific idea as a culture, as a language, as a geometry. And I believe that, from what I can tell, they set their culture up this way for the purposes of health, in a spiritual sense, in a physical sense, because they understood this to be more or less like a Ragonic structure. If the universe is built on this idea, then, and like say a healing system like homeopathy is built on this idea, then it follows from then that if you are involving yourself with a structure that is composed this way, a city that is composed this way, all the way down to the molecular level. Let's say the example of the Giza Pyramid, where they're pouring a polymer, which had extremely high levels of quartz in it and was piezoelectric. Quartz crystal is known to be a lattice structure. It's a recursive structure. It's a fractalized structure. So you have literally fractals at every level, and I think that their idea was, well, we're matching this wider metaphysical context all the way through. It's totally self-consistent, and homeopathy is just an extension of that. So then the Babylonian version of this, and we won't get into it because it's kind of a little weird, but the Babylonians came up with, or they didn't come up with, but they preserved this idea, this portion of the analogy that was referred to as sympathetic magic, and which gets very, very, very close to mesmerism in a lot of ways. So I'm going to go to Orient. Okay, this is a very interesting one, and I think, in my opinion, actually, a personal friend of mine wrote a very, very good book. His name's Joel David Morrison. He's I don't really want to call him an amateur philosopher, because nothing that he did was amateur, but he didn't formally study philosophy in school or anything like that. He, very much like a lot of smart people that I know, got very disillusioned with the formal academic process and just began doing his own work. Just forget it. I have a library card. What do I need a college for? So he wrote a book that's called, and he has a website. You can see his work, and you can have an introduction to what his work is. And I think actually his book is free, pretty sure. But he wrote a book that's called Spin Bits, which is a unification. Spin Bits Volume 1. It's a unification of the work of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who knows the inventor of the calculus, and Baruch Spinoza, and a lot of other people too. Heavy influenced by another man called Guillermo Deleuze, who did a lot of work on the manifold concept later on in the 20th century. Also relies heavily on a lot of Blavatsky and Theosophy and Kant and a lot of these things. So what are we talking about with the actual yin and yang? Well, immediately after this being described in this way, you immediately see the unity, your first division, and then you see the analogy being preserved. And this is precisely the way that the ancient Orient had it, and precisely why we see a lot of these coming through in traditional Chinese medicine, because they had a metaphysic that had a provision for this, and they as a culture have absolutely no problem understanding this whatsoever. Neither do Indians. I work a lot with a company, actually a pharmaceutical and nutraceutical company out of India, but they are very heavily into manufacturing homeopathic remedies because homeopathy is massive in India. It's just massive business. So, but when, in my conversations with Dr. Alok Shah, who was a tenured professor here at the University of Chicago Medical School, and he's done a bunch of work, especially in caffeine and stimulants. Their culture is so rife with this, thousands of years, so old that they have no problem speaking about this. It just makes sense to them. There's no problem whatsoever. This actually is, the reason that I put this in here is because a group of Russians did a bunch of research on pyramidal structures, and what they found is that when you light them up with radio frequency bands, these structures, these pyramidal structures actually begin to ring like a bell. And when they vibrate, they actually start to impose these infrasonic patterns on the media around them. And once you know that when they're built in a specific way, or they're modeled after the Giza plateau, and there are certain other things that you can do with the material and where you locate them that will amplify this effect, that you actually find this embedding of these waveforms as they exist. So you have one wider context in terms of a carrier wave, and you have all of them then fundamentally following that same mathematical or harmonic archetype all the way down to nothing. It's just insane, and it's unimaginable that whomever was responsible for building the pyramidal structures, say on the Giza Plateau, didn't have this in mind of some kind. They didn't just accidentally stumble upon some sort of universal, method of, what do we want to say, like atmospheric clearance or something like that. So that. So now we're going to move on to Greece, and this is where it starts getting a little bit materialistic and a little bit weird. So this was one of Pythagoras, to the Pythagorean, I suppose the basis for the Pythagorean mathematical system. And what this referred to as the Tetrachus. And basically what Pythagoras was an individual who went kind of like Christ, and kind of like a lot of people, he went abroad and began learning about these so-called Hermetic mysteries from people in the Far East. He traveled for about 20 years, and then he returned to Greece and started a school, and eventually was assassinated, because that's what you do to people who are revolutionizing the children with good ideas. So in his conceptualization, what you got is you had this retaining. So you had, from the point, you have the monad, 1 becomes 2, the dyad, 2 becomes 3, triad, and so on you move. And this is really a reference. He was attempting to impose a very formal geometry on the Kabbalistic idea, which was this one. And so what you really see is the unification of the original geometric concepts of point, line, and eventually becoming plane. And there really isn't any reason that can't then be established all the way back to the original analogy of the cleaving and establishing these these geometric forms. So you see across Kabbalah, you see the Hermetic influence across Greece, you see the Hermetic influences across all of these cultures, and you see this self-similarity that just transmits itself from time immemorial. And it happens to be a concept that we just simply do not take into account in modern physics, even though there are physical systems that have been developed that they're nowhere to be found in any sort of academia, which is kind of unironic for me at this point. And so if you were to set up, let's say, that Greek system on the same idea, on the same formalization, you were having this idea of self-knowledge or ignorance. So we have dichotomies here that are set up, and you can formalize them in the same way. So the Greek conceptualization of God, cosmos, and space. And just the original. Now, this is a modern notation that was developed by Chomsky and a bunch of other people that is applied to this. And you can see that to some degree, they had to know that this was going on. The ancient Greeks, is because you have the same concepts of God, you have the same concepts of, and there's no separation in their mind between this idea of the ineffable and from it emanating what we would call physical space and time. And when you get into the work of a Canadian man by the name of Paulo Correa, Dr. Paulo Correa, who's another kind of tragic individual in the sense that none of his work, I mean, he's been denied publication over and over and over again. And he probably is the person, he was the rightful heir to any credibility that is ever given to the application of a dissipative system to a biological system, because his work basically takes physics and just turns it on its head. So what he says is no, energy doesn't come out of space-time. He just flips it around. Einstein was wrong. From this energetic concept comes space-time. And so that's an exact reference, analogous reference back to our original concept where you have this extended sea of sameness, this extended indistinguishable energetic substrate from which all things come. Another man who has a very similar system, it's called subquantum kinetics. His name is Paul Laviolette, and he did some really good work. His work is a little clunky still for me because it has a primacy of the speed of light primacy and also the primacy of a particle, but it's the concepts in it are there, and it's a little more accessible than Korea is. It's really hard to plow through, actually. So let's get on to, so this is a picture of a Mayan temple. And the reason I referenced the Mayans earlier, but really what I wanted to say about this is that it's just this, you don't get architectural parity all across corners of the world with the same idea. And not only the same idea in terms of the architecture, but it's also the Mayan epic of creation, like the Enuma Elish in Sumerian or Babylonian, is called the Popol Vuh. And you might as well just take the Popol Vuh and lay it over the top of the end. They're identical, just about. It's crazy. And they also had provisions for this kind of structure being the place of worship, but by worship, we really have to start thinking about their idea of worshiping in a temple as the idea of being sort of in a infirmary that was a radionic structure that was designed to sort of pull in this primordial energetic substrate from which healing could occur. And they would also train their priests, their healers, their shamanic people were trained from a very early age inside of these in the sense that they would like charge them up with this so that they could distribute this and disseminate this amongst the people. And there really isn't any reason to suspect that this is kind of irrational or this is magic or woo, because now we have, if we have a physics, we have metaphysics, we have a physics that can describe these things, I don't see what there is to talk about. You know, we're going to have to fling particles at each other. It doesn't work that way. So getting into the kind of modern times. Now this is kind of where I wanted, ideally, naturally, to kind of, the time period I wanted to cut this presentation off at, because establishing this analogy all the way through history, this analogy all the way through language of history, and the history of languages. And you also see that that there are many medieval and dark periods, and you actually start to see through history where this concept actually rises and falls. And rises and falls, and the Enlightenment, medieval period, they're just exactly the same thing. And you get this idea that if that's a cyclical process, and perhaps then there's no reason that you couldn't presume that you couldn't design or you couldn't describe a cyclical process, let's say the orientation of a certain subset of planets around a star as then an overall carrier frequency, and that star revolving around another greater body central to it, another carrier, and so then you have this universal idea of this wave fractality as it carries through, and you really have a self-consistent metaphysical system then from which homeopathy emerges naturally, and you don't have to keep fighting with these physicists and these people who call you quacks and say you have no evidence, and the reality is that they just don't get it because their minds have been trained to be so lytical or analytical that they can no longer synthesize in any real way, and they can't establish these patterns and analogies throughout history. So this time period, so now we're on to, with Bach and M.C. Escher and Gödel, those are obviously 20th century references, but with Bach, we're referencing the time period through the Renaissance up through the Enlightenment. And of course, I think there are two really important figures to touch on here. One would be Giordano Bruno, who, in a book that's called Bruno and the Hermetic Philosophies by a man called Yeats, it's basically, we have this idea of Bruno as being this scientific martyr who was burned by the church. That's not what was going on. Giordano Bruno was a Hermeticist, and he became an extreme threat to those individuals who by this time had actually taken over the Catholic Church and who were practicing this Luciferian version of Hermeticism, and he became a threat because he was spreading it not only coherently, but wide and far. And basically what you see as we get into the Enlightenment, the people who try to reestablish this idea of Hermeticism inside of the academy or inside of culture get dealt with very swiftly. And there's a reason for that, and it's, in my opinion, historically because these individuals who I referenced earlier, who were kind of responsible for controlling certain things or socially engineering certain things, have been doing this for a very long time, and they don't want you to know their religion. They don't want you to know what they actually practice, and this is the reason that they have imposed what Webster Tarpley calls epistemological warfare on the public at large, including the academy, meaning they pump and propagandize this entirely an anathema in terms of philosophy out into public. You know, just think of particle physics, materialism, the rise of all that kind of stuff, analytical mechanics, while they themselves practice something completely different because they know that it has a specific functionality, that they can actually engineer their ideas, their linguistic ideas and their evolutionary thought and their energy and their imprint onto this physical medium that surrounds them, this ether concept kind of thing. And from that, then they induce you know, certain subsets of control features on a very large population of people. So, so Bruno, Nicholas of Cusa was another person who did some good work on the irreducibility of the universe. He calls it the circular proof. Leibniz is an interesting character because, and Leibniz is near and dear to my heart. Leibniz is my very favorite philosopher. And when you read Leibniz, you come across some very interesting things that sound very much like a robot, and some very interesting things that sound very much like he had actually gone throughout history. And there are three famous mathematicians upon which modernity is built, and we cannot argue with this, and that would be Newton, Descartes, and Leibniz. Now, when you read those three people, what you find is that they're saying the same thing. And all of them, at some point in the writings, more or less say, well, after studying sort of these ancient concepts of the geometers going way, 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 way back, what I have found is more or less that they had some sort of universal system of analysis. That universal system of analysis was capable of changing context seamlessly without there being any loss of translation. In other words, you could speak a normal language, and that would also serve functionally as you talking to them in a mathematical way, you talking to them in a logical way, you talking to them in an allegorical way, and so you have this language operating on all these different levels. And that it was a universal, and Leibniz called this character universalis. And he had said that he believes that these ancient geometries had developed this process, that it was a formalized and complete system that had been intentionally suppressed. And as you move forward in history and you start looking into the work of Kurt Gödel, who's a very important figure in the 20th century, he was a professional logician. He was kind of the nemesis of a very evil man called Bertrand Russell, who was basically the establishment mouthpiece. So Bertrand Russell wrote a piece called The Impact of Science on Society, and in that he more or less predicts, now this was written in the 20s, and he basically predicts or alludes to, he tells you that the establishment for which he is currently basically the mouthpiece for is going to alter you by means of genes, chemicals, and all kinds of nasty, fake, fraudulent kinds of foods. It's the same thing from a guy named Alfred Toffler, and the same thing from a guy called, oh, what's his name? I'll think of it. Anyway, they're all giving you premonitions of exactly what's going on today, which is GMO, fluoride in the water, all that kind of stuff, vaccination, pharmaceuticals. They knew that they were going to do this, and the point is that these people who are responsible for doing those very things are the same people that have been suppressing this metaphysic from getting out into the open. I would imagine they're the same people responsible for dealing with homeopathy as well. And that's the way that it always has been. So I guess to close, I would just kind of say, because I don't really have a lot more on this, it's just that there's a tradition that needs to be tapped here. There's a tradition that needs to be understood, that needs to be tapped, that needs to be formalized, that needs to be completed. And I don't think that we have to use the language that we are given by these other people, because we can do our own analysis and we can formulate our own language, and that's kind of what I'm doing. So that's it. Any questions? Sure.
So, of course, what you presented is the classic world.
Yes.
And there are others, Jacques Bauer, who Andre introduced me to, is a very excellent classical homeopathy in France, and he wrote in French. He went through the history of all the different cultures and looked for the similars written in the different cultures. So that work is out there in the homeopathy French, and that would be the history. But let's take Hahnemann. Hahnemann was very well versed in classical education, prodigy. He read all these theories, all these ideas, all this history in the original languages. He knew it, but it didn't stop him from taking a different approach to practical approach to helping people that we call monetized phenomenology. But he didn't start with the metaphysics. He didn't start with theory. He started with observations, the perceptible manifestations that we can observe. And without deciding which worldview was right and which was wrong, or which one was more complete or less complete, he just made observations, perceptible phenomena of the senses, the immediate sensory perceptions. And after doing it over and over and over again, similar to Goethe, his experiments on color versus light and morphosis, they were contemporaries. So he then looked at which metaphysics, which worldview supported what he actually observed. And that decision supports what you presented today, materialist or reductionist or duality worldview of a unified holistic worldview. So this has been a conflict in all cultures and all histories. We know which one is predominant right now. That's why we have to have our own language. So let me say a couple more things. We talked about phenomenology. Jacques Bauer, who looked into the history. And when I say about Goethe, you know, in Faust, he does talk about similars in part 2. I can't remember which stanza. So it is there. And in Vedas, it talks about similars. So,
The altar, at the altar, yeah.
and Jacques Bauer is documented exactly where in all these cultures.
In Faust, it's actually, he makes the reference to similars in actually 2 places. One of them is kind of being sort of, I don't know if it's satire or tongue-in-cheek, but he says something like, you can fix your hurt leg by stepping on it again, or something like that. Yeah, right.
Though they never met each other, and I did extensive research to see if they met each other, he did not. Goethe writes about Hahnemann a few times in his books, but Hahnemann never mentions Goethe. So, but anyway, they both do phenomenology, what we call in modern times the phenomenological method of science, or what Francisco Varela calls first-person science. We observe as opposed to the mainstream, which is called third-person objective, so-called objective world. So that's a couple of the things I wanted to say. There are examples of fractal structures still in Africa. Some of the villages and parts of Africa are built in a fractal way.
Yes.
There's a book on that one.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. I was going to actually include the African part of it, but when I started thinking about it, this is actually the point where I got up this morning. I'm an insomniac, so I don't sleep much. So I was up this morning about 3 o'clock, and I decided about 3 o'clock this morning that I was going to change some things. Where I come from, we call that changing horses in midstream. And one of the portions that I cut out was the out of Africa, or the Africa fractal pattern, because not only are there villages in Africa that still are today very clearly built on this concept. It's very much like the Mandelbrot set in a sense, recursive, but there are myths in African culture that actually you can still go to these, I suppose they would become like a kind of almost like a Stonehenge of Africa, these things that are laid out, and that the African natives actually believe in their myth, their creation myth, that's where we were created, as if though it was some technology that was utilized for some genetic engineering or something very similar to that, and that it is set up specifically in a fractal. And I didn't want to get into all that because it kind of made it even more sticky. So
makes me then just finished the presentation, but I made a chance this year on the current assumptions of mainstream medicine based on ontology, based on theories, and the assumptions in homeopathy. But to me, Hahnemann didn't start with the ontology. He started with observations. that's why we have a practical method that is withstood the test of time. It's based on manifestations of people's ideas. It's the actual methodology, a practical methodology.
Mm-hmm.
You can't confirm it.
Mm-hmm. The only thing that I would say to that is, because having gone through Homeopathy 1 and 2 with you, and you teaching us how Hahnemann came to his sort of his pure science approach. I think there's an article, I think maybe you wrote it. It was called Hahnemann's Pure Science. So, yeah, okay. The thing is that I have in my own reading on the subject is that I have just some questions about where he had gotten the idea originally from, because there were some significant overlaps and crossings and some life's experiences that he had with the Hermetic philosophy from which all of this comes, and he was, basically the librarian or the organizer for an aristocrat who had one of the largest collections in Austria at the time of this, kind of this from ancient Greek magical papyri all the way through. I suppose they could be called Dead Sea Scrolls now, but they weren't then. And stuff that I can't imagine that he didn't grab some of that kind of esotericism out of it too, and maybe he just decided to start testing it. I don't know. But that's the question that I have, is how could you be sitting in a library for any extended period of time full of all of these books, all of this esotericism, and then develop this this very complex and extremely well done system of medicine based upon that principle. And I would question, if there was a link between the two for me. But
there has to be a link. How do you decide?
Oh, testing it. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So, for instance, I meditate. Certainly, what I experience in meditation and allows me to have a framework or perspective of what we do practically, methodology, and reality. So we're all influenced by that. But how do we know our thoughts, our ideas, our concepts, our beliefs are right? And this is where Hahnemann gave us a guide. How do we know it's useful? How do we know it's practical? How do we know it works here on our embodiment in the physical?
Mm-hmm. So, but I mean, if you were to work in reverse now, in modern day, knowing what we know about Hahnemann and his method and how functional it is, and that it is, and I mean, if done properly, in my opinion, not that I'm an expert in homeopathy certainly, but seems to be the only curative, maybe, in existence, totally curative method. Actual curative.
That.
No, I know he doesn't, but I mean, just now.
Electrical, magnetic, and mesmerism,
mm-hmm.
animal magnetism, and as well as mineral magnetism.
So
at the end of the organon where he explored the other means that he say are dynamic.
Yeah. So, but if we are to identify with this method of Hahnemann's as being this universal, from our view as homeopaths and naturopaths, you have this vital universal system of medicine. Doesn't that then more or less presume that this kind of metaphysic is at least tangible? I mean, that's the way that I think. I mean, there has to be something there. It has to be an analogy for something greater in an infinite context to me. I can't imagine any system coming from something that isn't in some way self-similar to, its superstructure.
Use word like cosmos. Who has had experience in the whole cosmos? All these people who had some experience. It's like if you live in Chicago, do you know Chicago? Well, some people know every bar in Chicago. Some people know every expressway, toll in Chicago. Some people know every house in their neighborhood. So who knows all of Chicago? It's the same thing with people who have these experiences of a larger reality. They don't know, or they don't report on the wholeness of it. They only have bits and pieces of it. So you have to be careful who you identify with. Only part of the whole.
Well, I go along with Socrates in that. I mean, we don't know. But I mean, I suppose maybe is this comforting? Is that what does this help me out? I don't know, but it's
breaks you away from the mainstream way of thinking on Western science, which is very limited.
Yeah.
Very limited, and I'll bring out my language, how I define those limitations and how we make different assumptions. So, you know, I believe we need a unified language in Homeopathy. It's not there. You can't use the regular science on it.
Yeah, I guess the question would be, is this a rational way of looking at it? Is can you develop a notation in terms of linguistics this way to, you know, and then what it would look like if you started stuffing the repertory inside of it and seeing, you know, just as an algebraic function, what would happen? What would come out the other side? And that's just something that would take a lot of work.
But here's the re-image of the repertory instead of a linear, you know, thing. Categories, so structure. There should be a more dynamic way of making repertory. That's for people like you.
What else? Okay.
Because some people are thinking.
So thank you for the references. I'm going to look up the Norton lectures, for instance.
They're fantastic. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're fantastic.
I've listened to his lectures on music, but I didn't hear that.
Yeah, it's I happened to stumble upon it. I actually stumbled upon the Norton lectures through a man called Farrell, who does a lot of work on this topological metaphor of the medium, and really who is what kind of solidified it in my own mind. But I had been reading about it already, and then I came across this what I call the embryogenesis of a concept I came across in more people's work, and I was just like, wow, this is the same thing. And Farrell really goes back and shows you where it came from in history. He did his PhD at Oxford in patristics, so his specialty is examining old documents of all kinds. And this is just, he gave me the language so that I could describe the method that I had been sort of doing naturally without understanding why I was doing, because everything in physics at the time just seemed so disconnected and so discombobulated, and there was no analogy to be made at the levels. And I don't think the human mind functions that way, and I think that, quite frankly, that's why the vast majority of people are just like, especially with modern physics, the modern conception of physics and materialism are just like, this doesn't work. You just naturally get away from it. You don't want it. It doesn't work, you know, except for those kinds of people who have such a high complicity that they can sit there doing what they're told, irrespective of what they actually think themselves. I just have a serious conflict with that. So, okay.
Michael, can you, for the benefit of the people listening on the webinar, can you mention again? You said you can get the Norton lectures free from where was it?
I believe it's called opencultures.org.
Opencultures.org.
Let me be. I can just check really quick. Yeah. So it's not open. It's just www.openculture.com, and it has 11 hours of Leonard Bernstein's masterful lectures on music that were recorded at Harvard, and he goes through. But he goes through music and Chomsky's ideas on relationship between linguistics and the mind. And he takes this into poetry. He takes this into physics. He takes this, and at that point, then the first unity of physics is not electromagnetism. Actually, it becomes musical and acoustic, which makes a lot of sense, actually. And then this wider metaphysical context then emerges, and then you have a physic that, and again, a lot of these megalithic structures were very clearly infrasonically active in some way. It's just, they're still active in that way today, even though they've been torn apart and stripped and so forth. So I think it's the basis from which we can understand or get at a depth of homeopathy, how it works more so than utilizing conventional kinetics, and things have to have inertia and running into one another, and that's the only way that any reaction occurs. That's just doesn't work. So, yeah.
Just one of the references you mentioned that on Egypt was Farrell, and then also Christopher
Dunn. But I can give you about. I'm extremely interested in that subject. So Christopher Dunn, and also there's a Russian called Valery Uvarov. To my knowledge, these texts are free. He does a very good geometric analysis on the relationship between not only the Giza pyramids and what they were for, but their relationship then in terms of longitude, latitude kind of geometry with other megalithic structures around the world. And when that emerges, you start seeing this grid that they had constructed, emerge. But Farrell has a book called Grid of the Gods that deals with that subject specifically. He takes you all over the world to show you how these are very, very precise geometric relationships between not only the substructure of the structures themselves in the material and where they're orientated on the planet, but how they're actually facing and relating to one another. And that's where you get this idea that these people had some sort of universal kind of analysis at that time. It's just either been totally taken away from us or lost because of something. So, and I think homeopathy could do well to be analyzed in that way. So,
I may throw out a name for European science. Science non-Vedic. That is the modern author Henry Morton, UFT. He passed away recently. There's a couple of videos on YouTube of him. But in his book, the whole thing, especially the first part, he talks about parts and wholes applied to symptoms and seeing the whole picture of a person. Because right from the European science and right in modern language.
Orange at the top. Yeah. Just like that. Are you willing to share your slides?
Oh yeah,
Let me show you who's online.
yeah, absolutely. Are they? Do you just? Do they stay on your computer?
Yeah, or we'll have them on there. I'll just keep them in email.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you want me to go back, I could produce. In my notes, my own notes, I have most of the sources that I would be referencing throughout this, even though I kind of said them. I have websites and books. Gödel Escher Bach is actually a book by a man named Douglas Hofstadter, who's a researcher in AI, various kinds of. Just a really interesting guy, but did a lot of work in recursion and did a lot of work in recursion.
That's a reference. So maybe if you could get those to me, email them to me, and then I can give them to Lisa if anyone else wants them.
Sure.
Just
absolutely. Yep. Okay.
Great job.
Thank you.
So for the people on the webinar, we're just going to be taking a 5-minute break, and we'll be back in about 5 minutes for Tim Feuer's presentation.
Great. Awesome. 2 days. Yeah. Quick read, right? Here's an interesting. Oh wow, those
Have you seen that?
No. Yeah, definitely.
Kind of the same stuff.
Your office is close by, right? So
Yeah, we're.
Oh yeah,
We're the next building over. 400 East, 20 seconds to back.
perfect.
Yeah.
So if anything, I can just come by there.
Yeah.
Oh wow, that's awesome. Can't wait to do this. So what was your like, feedback or about that? What do you thought?
Water.
Okay.
And interesting, right? It's interesting. I found we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
We'll talk about nanoparticles. And if it's into the water, that's probably the nanostructures in water, the actual ingredients. And then it's like, what about water? So we'll talk about it.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I'd love to. I could bring you by a few gallons so you can try it, and happy to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
You do the electrolysis. See,
Yeah.
So I read a site that. So I started looking up
There's a
I do
lot.
RO water, and all these kind of minerals are taken out.
Yeah.
It's not structured.
Yeah.
So there are sites where they add the minerals back in, with and without RO, and then they add structuring.
Yeah.
But the electrolysis is the only way where you get a negative
Right.
ORP.
Right.
So it becomes an antioxidant.
Right.
So,
It's super.
but in nature, apparently that doesn't happen. So they kind of so there was like nature that's go to that extreme.
Right. They say that it's like glacial waters are. It's trying to mimic that.
Right.
High hydrogen.
Exactly.
So.
Right. They're more alkaline than. Still not even negative.
Right.
Or just lower positive.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, just the research on molecular hydrogen is just on its own. Water is one way to take it in, but there's other.
Right. That's what it's all.
Yeah. That's
like the hydrogen. It's basically an antioxidant.
Right.
It gets the best life right now.
directly detoxes hydroxyl radicals and contamination in the water. That's amazing. So it's pretty cool stuff. Yeah, my goal is to do whatever I can with the water, and I feel like it's not only water, but then how it's combining it with things like things like cannabis. I get really excited.
Yeah, I think that, pharmaceuticals are the main thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I just love it. So true.
Not so good as they
No, not at all. That's true. Yeah. Oh wow. I was thinking about this already. That's awesome. Oh, relax.
I know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she's coming to feed at night.
Thank you very much. So I was going to ask you about colors. I actually have heard of people saying, I've never tried it personally, but I know one of the previous homeopaths at work at National.
He did in some ways.
But I was talking to him about doing
pressure all the time from Nazis to communism to,
and he said that
and really got to turn into a real scientist.
a lot.
So the modern, most modern that I have
With
come
their
across,
transitions, so this is getting even more out there than
Dr. Paulo,
but here's that German, I mean, this is not good research.
Yeah.
So his work is a master's in biophysics, a PhD in pharmacology.
Okay. Research.
Dr. Paulo, and his work currently
What's his name?
natural functions of biology, which
But
is
they didn't
basically
use, they didn't go mainstream
stripping air
of his research, because they did it
stripping
in
air
Nazi
out
Germany.
classical nature of a closed system as a mathematical. Just getting rid of that.
Yeah.
So hard
Yeah.
in this way, and then from that, then reorienting the idea of energy and
That's what they mean by max relax.
pre-regime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
We have another step in there.
Yeah. I'm going to present stuff I did on the after this week, Nanoparticles. Like, briefly. And then we're also going to talk about water.
Oh, thank you. But
Is there a way I can actually get
Another man was
that?
Well, I was thinking about that.
I mean,
I can give it to you as a Word document. I'm a bit reluctant. I thought about it. I'm a bit reluctant to give you the iBook because one of the problems in class we're having, there's so many different versions.
well, that's why I want.
If you start creating another version and I have a version, I don't think it's a good idea.
No, I don't want to create another version, and I won't make any changes to it without.
What I can do is, if there's a section you want to edit, I can provide that to you as a Word document. So then you can make whatever changes you want. I think that might be better.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, because even in class when I try to teach, not having the real book, I don't have access to certain functions that the real book has.
Let me see if I can give you a form that's like copy protected. That's the main thing. Let me look and see what allows it to do. Yeah. But that's my worry. It's like part of the problem in class. I know as a student, I have to tell them 6 different pages because some people have one thing of the course pack, one have another version, and then some have the iBook.
Well,
and in the iBook, once you're on the iBook, it's always the same page because you can always update.
Well, that has nothing to do with different versions. That has to do with me. I just wanted to be able to access what your current did. So if I make changes, it's not on an old version or an old current, then I'm working on nothing yet.
Yeah.
So I want to just work on the sections that I have.
Let me think about it. I think it's a way to do that.
Because I'm not going to make changes to it and incorporate it without you.
Well,
It would just be a version. It would just be a version of the utilized of teaching. So that it's your current version. See the version I have, which is the PDF, which is the version of what you're using. Well, actually, it doesn't.
No, it's a current version.
Okay.
That's a current
So
version.
what about just?
So what you're using is the Mater Medica. Yeah.
That's right. That's the only version
There's
I
no that. There's no. It's just a linear. There's nothing special on that. It's just linear. It's a linear page by page by page by page. Each Mater Medica. And but they're all the same. It's the summary. It's the graphs. And if there's any rubrics, then it's the whole written part. And then it's cases. It's the same for each one.
Well, that's what I would like.
It's no different.
That's what I would like to do some possible video on. Maybe some, I want to read some of those cases. Maybe add some new cases. I'd like to do some bite-sized pieces of the current cases. If somebody reads something, it's too long, they don't want to read it. They look at it and they don't want to read it.
Right.
So I want to make it look like I want to make it look equal. I want to make the paragraphs.
First thing, I think you had a good point about the NAM the summary is a bit too long. It needs to be tapered down. It's like 30 points. It needs to be maybe down to 15 or so.
Yeah, that would be helpful to choose the best from there, and also to make a little more of a, the brief should be a little longer. It's supposed to be not very brief. So I mean, off of the material, I don't have no current material. So we have a current maybe Andres, because when I did, okay, when
No. What? Look at the PDF. That's the most current version of the book. Yeah. So I sent you a new one. So it should be exactly the same. So you just have to look up NAM.
I don't know what my version. All I tell.
Well, look at NAM. Just look at NAM. Go to NAM.
Okay, so let me show you my problem. Ready for my problem? Since I can't get evidence off of it. You were trying to.
Yeah, the thesis whole manifest and water and this things that are just,
So it's supposed to be
Combination for me with sugar.
We have seen on a laugh.
This phone is what I should be doing.
Oh.
So, yeah, it's interesting.
I
Yeah, I will. Nice. Yeah, I just did it. It's fascinating. I drip some blood on paper. They literally the next day they receive them. Yeah, it's awesome.
So let's continue. In the sake of time, I'll keep it short. Already did this at Homeopathy Club, but I think the only one that was there was Adrian. But so I'll review it quickly for the rest of you. I think we had a good discussion. Michael, thank you for bringing up some interesting concepts. It's always, whenever someone starts talking about philosophy, Dr. Shepard does that at times, and you did today. It's like it really bends your mind a little bit, and oh my God, it's snowing. Wow. I just noticed that. I think part of the issue is it's like a lot of us believe there's some truth out there, but unfortunately with our minds we get stuck in our, what we see in everyday life and what we're told and how we're, being led to believe things are, and it's like, but to try and get at that it's difficult. It's not easy, and I think what you said is really true. It's like the words, we don't really have the words, and the physicists have a certain group of words they use. And the material scientists have a different group of words. And the homeopaths have a different group of words, but they're probably all talking about the same thing, but they can't communicate because all the words are different. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I think we all need to think about that. So this is a talk that I just recently gave for Homeopathy Club. I've kind of given it several times about homeopathy as nanopharmacology. And it's interesting, the more I'm getting into this research, it's like, what you get to is that, yeah, they're finding nanoparticles in homeopathic remedies, but what I'm realizing now is that that might not be the active ingredient. And it's something about the water that's the active ingredient. So let's.
Isn't that what Joe said? Their structures?
Yeah, and I'm going to mention her research. I'm going to mention her. So nanostructures in water. So really with homeopathy, the problem gets to be this minimum dose, which is kind of a natural corollary of the law of similars. When you're using something similar to treat a person, if you give a conventional dose, the person gets worse. Too much aggravation. And so Hahnemann developed this whole system of, well, I just use a drop of a tincture, or dilute a drop and give a part of that, and then he developed this whole system of dilution. And this is where we run into problems with conventional thinking because, hey, once you've diluted beyond Avogadro's number, there's nothing there. In our office, we routinely use, Joel, I don't know if you use up to CM, you sometimes use DM and MMs, right?
Yesterday, 50 M.
Okay, 50 M. So, I mean, I routinely use this whole scale in patients and find that they all work for different patients. Some people need lower, some need higher, some need the highest of the high potencies, right? But for people who think in a materialistic way, anything you get beyond this point, it's how could there be anything left of the starting material? So there's a bunch of hypotheses about how homeopathy could work. And the difficulty with understanding the mechanism of homeopathy is in the fact that I think probably some element of all these mechanisms are at play. Memory of water. So water might form some structures where it can remember things that were in it. Or clathrate formation, something similar to that. Quantum, there's some quantum effects going on. When you get nanoparticles that are like very small, like 10 nanometers and less in size, which has been shown to occur in homeopathic remedies, you get into the realm of quantum effects. They call them quantum dots. And so they have peculiar properties, and they can have more effects on cells and such. We're making these dilutions in water, so you're getting silica nanoparticles in there. That's part of it. And then more recently, we're looking at nanoparticles of the starting materials, but also water nanostructures that are maybe formed as a result of those nanoparticles. And of course, when we talk about 100 nanometers, here's I think this is a rat blood cell, something like that. You see how small it is, 100 nanometers. If you're talking less than 100 nanometers, you can see how it'd be easy for it to easily get through the membrane and maybe even into the nucleus. And in fact, the latest research is showing that homeopathic remedies, and I'll show you one study that shows that the dilutions, even though these nanoparticles sometimes present in femtograms per milliliter, like 10 to the minus 15 grams per milliliter, they still have biologic effects. They still affect protein synthesis in the cell. So the first study, this was published in 2010. Before this, homeopaths said, well, it seems like our remedies work, but we don't know what the active ingredient is, or we don't know that it seems like there shouldn't be anything in it. But one group of researchers, they actually did electron microscopy, and they found nanoparticles of starting materials. They only looked at metals, and only 30 and 200 C. And they did electron microscopy. They said, oh, we found nanoparticles. And then they did electron diffraction and spectroscopy to determine, in fact, that these were nanoparticles of the starting material. Why did they use metals? Can you think of why would you use a metal versus like a plant-based remedy?
Because probably it's not going to be destroyed by the electron diffraction process.
Right, it's very interesting. I saw some pictures where as you do the electron diffraction, the more you do it, the nanoparticles, they fade away, they sublimate. Yeah. That's one point. But if you think of it, in a plant, if you have a tincture of belladonna, how many active ingredients do you have? Hundreds. So this is part of the problem. So they tried to simplify it. It's like, okay, we're doing preliminary, we'll just do it on metals. Here's some pictures of the nanoparticles. This is from Stannum Metallicum, or tin. And some of them are pretty big here. This is 200 nanometers. You can see there's clusters. The nanoparticles tend to cluster together, which is interesting. When then we shake it again to go to another dilution, you're dispersing them again, and then they can continue. The concentrations would plateau, they found, at a certain number of picograms per milliliter, which is within the range of action of certain hormones, like T3 here, estradiol. They're picograms per milliliter for the active dose in the blood, in the serum. And this also falls within the range of hormesis, which is 10 to the minus 6 to 10 to the minus 12 molar. So picograms would be 10 to the minus 12. Okay. So we have to say, if the concentration of nanoparticles plateaus for a 6 and a 30 and a 200C, why are they different? So let's talk about hormesis. Hormesis is, in toxicology, is an important concept where high doses cause, this is inhibition, it should go down. High doses of substances cause inhibition and finally death if you get a big enough dose. And then you reach a point that's called the no observed adverse effect level. And generally in toxicology, they only look at that till that point. Oh, he's awake. He's looking at something. He's going to figure out what's going on. I'm sorry, she. Even better yet, she. And then what they find, and some researchers have said, well, why don't we take even lower doses than the no observed effect level? And what they found is they get a stimulation of function. And it's a very reproducible effect. So large doses inhibit, smaller doses stimulate function, which is important for toxicologists because, you know, if you think of lead in the environment, if you have to get the lead levels in the environment to 0 to get no negative effects, that's impossible. But at least you get it to a low level, and then maybe it could even, you could argue maybe even it's beneficial. It could be beneficial to some people. So for toxicologists, this is a big deal. The database of hormesis is huge. 5,600 dose-response relationships, all males, females, at least 900 agents, and this is as of 2005. Plants, viruses, bacteria, fungus, insects, all different endpoints. And it's very reproducible from organism to organism. The maximum stimulatory response less than 2-fold greater than the control, with a width of about 100-fold. Bell and Schwartz, typically with the curve, this is dose and this is response. This is stimulation up above, inhibition down below. Typically, with bulk form, we look at a hormetic curve here. Bell and Schwartz note that when you use nanoparticles, you shift the curve to the left because they're so reactive by their nature, because they have a very large surface area to mass ratio, so they're very reactive, much more than bulk material. So when we have nanoparticles, probably this curve is shifted either in 10 to 1,000 times lower dose. We'll still have an effect. Okay? And you get, again, inhibition, stimulation. So the question is, why do the nanoparticles remain? So the same group of researchers, Chikramani being the main author, published in this Material Science journal, that they said, well, maybe what happens when you're making a remedy, you form bubbles, and you have the nanoparticles, and they float to the surface with the bubbles and form a monolayer, and the monolayer is preserved. In fact, that's what they found. So studies have unequivocally established the raw materials in nanoparticle form. So far, there's been, as far as I'm aware, 12 labs that have found nanoparticles in homeopathic remedies. So we propose a hypothesis to explain how the nanoparticles are retained. Once the bulk concentration is below a certain threshold, a few nanograms, this would be 10 to the minus 9 grams per milliliter, this would be partly parts per billion, all the nanoparticles levitate to the surface to form a monolayer, and that's preserved. It's like a monolayer. There's attraction, it wants to remain, and even though you dip something in or you do coarse coffee, you pour it out, and it adheres to the glass, it gets preserved. So dilutions are only apparent. You think you're diluting, but you're really not. And this is a graphical representation. This lattice work here is a lactose. And then you see you get the bubbles, and then the black particles or the nanoparticles, they all levitate to the surface, and that's what's preserved. So if the concentration is the same for 6C, 30C, 200C, why is it that when you give a patient a 6C, they stop responding, then you give them a 30C, right? They stop responding to a 30C, they start responding to a 200C, and then a 1N. In practice, this is what we find all the time, every day, right? So how could they be different? Well, this researcher looked at membrane fluidity, which was looking at nanoparticle size. The bigger nanoparticles have more effect on the membrane's fluidity, and the smaller particles less. And so he was able to calculate, they looked at cuprum metallicum, so just copper. They looked at membrane, several potencies, 630, 200C. And since membrane is the primary site of action of most drugs, so they found that homeopathic drugs fluidize the membrane at all potencies. The effect is less significant at higher potencies because the particle size gets smaller, decreases with potency. And here's the Phyto Micrographs, the electron micrographs actually. And you can see it's progressive. This is 200 nanometers, this is 20 nanometers, this is 2 nanometers. So the nanoparticle size is going down. And here's a distribution. With a 6C for cuprum, it's about between 10 and 20, 30 nanometer size particles. At a 30C, it's down to 1 to 3, and at 200C, it's less than 1 nanometer. These are what we call, both of these are really quantum dots. They did do a control here, no nanoparticles. It's interesting, Iris Bell has done research on nanoparticles using remedies, using controls of just solution without any active ingredient with a stopper. She finds nanoparticles because the stopper, when you put apparently a cork stopper in glass and shake it, it's interesting, one of the ways of making nanoparticles is to use a plant tincture, phytolacca, other plant tinctures that you can put silver nitrate in and it will self-create nanoparticles. Something about plant tinctures, that's one of the ways of forming nanoparticles. So if you use that as a control, like with a glass bottle with a stopper, even the control will have nanoparticles. But they're different. They're not as stable as with remedies. And here you can see the particle sizes going down with higher potency. So that could explain. You keep shaking and diluting, it makes sense. I think intuitively it makes sense. If you're shaking and diluting, and the more you shake, you have these particles, and you're adding all this friction, they're getting frayed, they're getting smaller.
Why is that more active? Why is it more healing?
Again, because you're changing the surface to mass ratio, so the more surface area, and the more it's getting to be quantum, it's more reactive. Smaller nanoparticles are more reactive. Yeah. And it's a little more complicated. I'll show you that in a minute. One researcher, Carr, in 2015 published this, that actually, knowing that the nanoparticles are there, you can actually use that maybe in manufacturing. If you don't know the potency of something, you can look at the substance, see what the nanoparticle size is, and there's a mathematical formula that describes the relationship between Y, which is nanoparticle size, and X, which is the potency. And you'll see they went from looking at, okay, you look at cuprum, zinc, aurum, even aconite, you see the different nanoparticle sizes. You notice for the aconite, it's much higher because you're probably dealing with, you're dealing with organic chemicals that are bound together in nanoparticles. And you see how, but there's a certain distribution of the change, and it fits this formula. So, and for each remedy, A and N are constants. So if you know A and N for each remedy, if you show me the nanoparticle size, Y, you can see here, this is with the 30, this is with the 6, this is with the 30, this is with the 200C. It follows this curve. If you know A and N, you can calculate then what the potency is. So this could be useful for manufacturing. But it varies. The A and N vary for each remedy. So it's the same curve, but the constants are different with each remedy that they looked at. We've looked at, well, we did just look at plant-based. Here's another study looking at lycopodium and nanoparticles, and they found nanoparticles all the way up to cm. And here you see the 6C, 30C, 200C, 1M. (10M, 50M, cm). And then here they did a control, it was negative. Now here they looked at particle size, but they didn't have a model to look at particle size, and they found the particle size didn't really change much, but there were a lot of clustering. So they weren't looking at the membrane fluidity, so they really probably wasn't a good study to look at particle size. And they only looked at carbon and oxygen content. It varied from potency to potency. And the problem with doing this kind of study, looking at the nanoparticles, proving that it's part of the starting material, is hard because here are the active ingredients in lycopodium. I mean, there's hundreds of different chemicals. So which ones are the combinations? It's much easier. That's why mainly for the nanoparticle research they've looked at metals, because it's much easier. You have one substance, one atom that you're looking at, or a crystal of one atom versus, you know, dozens and dozens and dozens of chemicals. Of course, the pharmacognosists would say, oh, the active ingredient in lycopodium is lycopodiene. I remember once giving a homeopathic talk to a pharmacognosist, and that's when they said, well, okay, belladonna, what's the active ingredient? Well, atropine. But it's more complicated than that, because it's interesting. In homeopathy, atropine, how often have we used it as a remedy? I mean, I think I used it once, and I don't think it really did much. Belladonna we use all the time. So it's when you take the plant, the way nature encompassed it, there's a wisdom there. Maybe we don't understand it, but there's a wisdom that nature put it there. It's reproducible. That plant has the same characteristics, similar if you harvest it at the same time under same conditions. It has certain chemical properties. That is useful. The whole is useful. But when we boil it down to one, quote, active ingredient, it's not so useful homeopathically. So this is the first time, now Chikramani, again, they published this just this year. And what journal is this? Oh, this is Homeopathy, the journal Homeopathy. So they showed for the first time that the Hormesis studies have generally been done not with homeopathic preparations. So this is the first time they actually used a homeopathic preparation and showed that, in fact, there was a hormetic effect with the nanoparticles in the homeopathic preparation. So here, let's read through this. Against all beliefs and principles of conventional dilution, we have shown the nanoparticles of the starting materials are unequivocally found in 30 and 200 C remedies at concentrations of a few picograms per milliliter. Our aim was to answer the important question of whether such negligible medical concentration elicit a biological response. So the skeptics now have to say, kind of, well, 12 different labs have found nanoparticles, but so what? How could they be active? They're too small. They're in picograms per milliliter. It's too small. So metal-based homeopathic remedies were analyzed. They used a Hep G2 cell line. These are basically hepatocellular carcinoma cells that are, the reason they use these for cell culture is because they just keep dividing. They never die. They never have apoptosis. They never finally die off. Like most cells, most normal cells will divide so many times and then die. These cancer cells, by definition, they just keep dividing and dividing and dividing, so they're great for doing experiments on. And they looked at, was there any stimulation of, to discern whether hormesis was a cell activation effect. They looked at, was it cell activation, was it just stimulating protein synthesis, or did it also cause proliferation of the cells, cause them to divide more? And they found that it was only protein synthesis. And they took the remedies and they actually diluted them even further, so the nanoparticles were only in femtograms per milliliter, which is lower, 10 to the minus 15, so lower than the 10 to the minus 12 that most of the hormesis researchers done. And they found that it did produce proliferation-independent hormetic activation, stimulating protein synthesis. And they say, well, why would such a low dose have such an effect? And we'll talk about that. They have a possible mechanism for that. So hormetic activation has been shown for the first time with standard homeopathic high-potency remedies. And here are a couple of the graphs. This is looking at argentum metallicum, or silver. And here's inhibition of protein synthesis down here at higher doses. And then as you get to lower concentrations, you get a stimulation of protein synthesis. And all these little asterisks here, it's all statistically significant. And it's for the 6C, 30C, and 200C. And the same with stannum metallicum. These are significant. These differences here for here and here are significant. So higher doses, higher concentrations inhibit, lower concentrations stimulate. It's a hormetic effect. Yeah?
I was just reading, a week or so ago, I was reading somebody come up with a theory of ultra-high dilution based on it. They actually tested to be radioactive after the high dilution. So specifically, I think it was in the M50 M range. Mm-hmm. And they had concocted this, I don't remember if this was my thinking or their thinking, theoretically, but basically they had concocted this idea where you trap a saltwater solution between plates of electric capacitor, you can actually, it precipitates more slowly than salt water just sitting out in the open jar. Mm-hmm. And so that the whole concept of succussion was what we are doing is by producing using these shock waves, you're actually reorienting, forcing this lattice structure to reorient, and to, the reference is to further like nanomatize the particles into smaller and smaller. What you're actually doing is breaking them from this transient relationship between a particle and a wave. You're actually allowing the water itself to sort of almost like a deuterium or something that is anything else that's radioactive. You're actually stuffing more physicality inside it than it's sort of naturally designed for, where you're stretching this lattice without succussion, and as you stop the succussion of shock wave, as it comes back together and reorients itself into more of this energy can actually be stored for a short amount of time, and then the entire dilution then becomes radioactive. So there's nothing. I
haven't seen anything about the radioactivity. You can send me that article. I'd be interested. But I think what really you mentioned about the water. Really, I think the water is. These particles are doing something with the water, and probably that could be the active ingredient, or one of the active ingredients, depending on the potency. So,
but the assumption there is that protein synthesis is, they know is going to be interfered by these metals, or interfered by everything.
That's how they're seeing is it having an effect on the cell, looking at protein synthesis. Yeah. So that's like, what is the remedy doing? Is it having any effect? One of the effects you can look for is it would make the cells proliferate. Actually, they did studies on that, and they're showing the cell cycle didn't change. It didn't change proliferation. But protein synthesis did change, and different potencies obviously have different effects. Some significant, some not. So I don't. Why did they pick Argentum metallicum and Stannum metallicum? I think it had more to do with, sure, they can have effects on cells, but which proteins and such, you know. And again, I think because the reason they're staying with metals is because it's just easier to see the nanoparticles. So why in such low concentrations would these nanoparticles have an effect? And they said basically most nanoparticles are made to be kind of consistent size, but by doing the homeopathic preparation is kind of crude, and what happens is you end up with all different sizes and irregular shapes. And their hypothesis was that it's these irregular shaped nanoparticles. They're not all, these are standard nanoparticles. They're all like regular shaped. With homeopathic preparations, the nanoparticles are all different sizes and sharp and this and that, and that's why even at lower doses, they can still have an effect. They're more biologically active. These irregular nanoparticles are known to be more biologically active. Interesting. These are the 12 labs that have replicated with all different types of nanoparticles, even including silica. I always tell students, whoever figures out how homeopathy works is going to get a Nobel Prize. Not today or tomorrow, but eventually. Because it involves so many different disciplines, and Luc Montagnier is on his way. And what he said, he already got the Nobel Prize for co-discovery of the HIV virus. It's interesting. He was a good friend of Jacques Van Veniste, who in the 80s came up with this idea of the memory of water. He found that really high dilutions of IgE could still cause basophils to degranulate, even though there was no IgE left in the solution. And he published his research, and his reward was they had a physicist and a magician go to his office and debunk his work. Yeah, Randy, yeah. The guy's a joker. So Luc Montagnier was a good friend of Ben Veniste, so he kind of took up some of his research, but he totally kept it under wraps. He didn't publish any of it until after he got his Nobel Prize. Smart guy. And so from doing work on homeopathic dilutions, what he says, what I can now say is that high dilutions used in homeopathy are right. High dilutions of something are not nothing. They are water structures which mimic the original molecules. His whole thing is that water, when it's around these dilutions, it forms what he calls nanions, which are water structures, which are the active ingredient. So this is his study that he published. They run into this problem in microbiology and virology where even though you filter a bacteria or a virus, sometimes the filtrate will become infective. Even though you have a filter that's smaller than the particle size. So they're like, what the heck's going on here? We've filtered it out. It shouldn't be infective. So what he did is probably from Ben Veniste, he did homeopathic dilutions of these filtrates of and it only works with pathogenic bacteria or their DNA. He found it wasn't just the cells, it was also the DNA itself, and even parts of the DNA will produce an electromagnetic signal. But the only way you get the signal is if you do a homeopathic dilution. And there's certain dilutions which are positive, others aren't. This is the device they use. So they did the filtrate, they hooked it up to a computer, put a coil, and then like a sound card program, and you can actually see the frequency. And this is some pictures. This is the background noise, and here you can see a standard. This is intensity of the signal. This is time going down, and this is the frequency range from 0 to 200 kilohertz, which is in the audible range. And this would be a standard signal without any signal. And then you can see where there's an active signal, this is at a certain potency, you see this additional signal here. He hasn't differentiated yet for different remedies, but that's his whole idea, is that maybe we'll be able to differentiate things just by taking someone's blood. You can see which viruses they're, you know, that they have, something like that. An easier test. Of course, he's still thinking allopathically, but he's an allopath. We have to give him a little break. He's doing research at helping homeopathy, so give him a break. He's actually a very nice gentleman. I met him at the Weston a few years back. One of the students in school here, we were there at the conference, Autism One conference. And I sat down and talked to him, and he was very, I mentioned about some of the nanoparticle research that I was familiar with, and he was very, very nice guy, very open-minded. His wife was kind of watching over like a hawk, like, what are these guys going to do? But it's homeopaths. But here you can see one, this is from Mycoplasma purium, which is a mycoplasma that is found often with HIV. And you can see the active, these are the same as baseline. And then once you get to a D7 or a 7x potency, all the way up through 12x, it's positive, and then 13x becomes negative again. He didn't do higher than that. But maybe you'd see what others have found. Ross Runtia, one of our anthroposophical members, has done research on seedlings, where you do different homeopathic dilutions. You expose seedlings and to like a 6x, 7, 8, 9, 10, and you see like you have a lot of seedlings, and you see how does a growth differential occur. And what you find is you get certain peaks and valleys. Peaks and valleys. It's like a sinusoidal curve. And it's interesting, like 30C is a peak, 200C is a peak, 6C is a peak, 12C is a peak, and then there's a trough. So you get, so he's seeing maybe one of these peaks, but maybe there's more, who knows?
What frequency? Are there specific frequencies?
Yeah, I'd go blind looking here, but it's in this range here, whatever this is. I think it goes from 0 to 20,000 hertz, something like that. They haven't, it looks the same, so far they haven't gotten it down to the point where it looks different for different substances. It's just same in the same area. So they need to fine tune it a little bit.
What do they say about the disappearance of the signal?
Oh, he says it's gone. But see, he's...
If it's electromagnetic, why would that happen?
Right. But see, I think, you know, again, he's thinking like conventional scientists. Oh, yeah, it went away, so it's gone. I would think if they kept going, maybe they'd find another peak. But, you know, it's like it's already so, you know, interesting. It's like he's already getting the realm of homeopathic dilutions. It's like he didn't want to push it.
So is that sort of the same idea behind what they're doing with radionics machines, where they're trying to get like frequencies of remedies and stuff? So is that sort of akin to that?
So this is what he did. This is kind of like radionics. He took it a step further. He said, well, what's going on here? So he took the filtrate, prepared a homeopathic dilution so that it would have the signal, got the signal, and then he took another tube. So, and this was DNA filtrated. So it was just the DNA, the pathogenic bacteria DNA, filtered it, so got the filtrate, made a homeopathic dilution, put it here, got the signal, and then played it back to a tube of plain water. Just water. And then in this water tube, he added base pairs and DNA polymerase, and it reconstituted the original DNA with 98% accuracy. So what he purported is that there's this electromagnetic signal, and that informs the water, and then that's how it reforms the DNA. I gave Adrian a book. There's a scientist who's doing work on engines and trying to get rid of clutter and stuff in the engines. And so he's found this thing that water can have a double helical structure. And he has pictures with atomic force microscopy, you can take pictures of these structures. And he finds by using these structures in engines and mechanical applications, you get better function. You know, so for mechanical people, mechanical engineers, or for mechanical sciences, this is important. We're starting to use these water nanostructures. Fortunately, in medicine, we're still a little behind the curve. We're entrapped by the big pharma that we need their expensive drugs.
I was going to mention, this is one of the points that I was making that we parse out too long with I said that the first unity of physics is musical, it's acoustic, not electromagnetic. So here we are operating in the acoustic range.
This is acoustic range, 0 to 20,000 hertz.
Yeah, and that's one of the main kind of points that light operates in this acoustic range, and the reason that we couldn't call electromagnetic radiation in terms of microwave, et cetera, is actually harmful. It actually takes away the water's ability to formulate these specific classical structures.
And there are studies with different models with homeopathic remedies where if you expose it to so much microwave radiation, like from a cell phone, that's why I always tell people, keep your cell phone away from your remedies. Like 2 or 3 calls on a cell phone, the effectiveness of the remedy will go down. Yeah, it's disrupting the coherence. So he calls these structures nanions, other people call them nanostructures. And this is exactly, as someone mentioned, Dr. Pollack came and gave us a presentation on her research. She had an injury to her knee, and she found that, just empirically, that by putting high-potency arnica and ledum and rust tox on her knee, it healed quicker. And so she said, I could develop a product for plastic surgeons to use. And here you see, with her product, it's basically high-potency arnica and maybe some other remedies. You put it on, and basically there's less bruising versus where there's not. And she has a lot of plastic surgeons using this now. Actually, arnica, if you talk to plastic surgeons, they all know about arnica. They don't know about homeopathy, but they all know about arnica because they know patients take arnica, they get less bruising, they're very happy.
It's the easiest way to deal with somebody who doesn't, especially somebody like the chiropractic staff and biomedical staff. Just know that. So homeopathy's got nothing behind it. Just give them arnica and say, you work out, yes. Feel sore, yes. Take this. They come back the next day. So what then? Are you sure that you believe homeopathy?
Exactly. That's exactly it. So probably more people have come to homeopathy because of arnica than anything else. So what she found, so she said, oh, it's very interesting. You mentioned the soul was a 3x. Virtually all topical applications of homeopathic remedies are with very low potencies. So there's material substance there. And that's probably what's the active ingredient. Dr. Pollack said, well, I want to use a high potency. And she had done just empirically. She took water, put 10M in it, and put it on a paper towel and put it on her knee, and it worked. So she said, I need to get something out of this. I need to make money so I can reinvest in homeopathy. So I'm going to get a patent on a gel system. And what she first did is she made the gel. And a gel is basically like making Jell-O. You put the powder, you put water, you stir it, and the protein in the gel, it cross structures, and then the water all gets bound, and then it's jiggly, but the water doesn't come out. It's all structured water, right? She found, okay, so I made my gel, I put the arnica in it, I put it on, the bruise didn't work. So you have your nanoparticles there, but it didn't work, right? Because we know up to 10M, you still have nanoparticles. So I said, what the heck is the problem? So she said, well, let me do it different. Let me take the water, put the remedy in it, dissolve it, stir it, get it going, and then form the gel. Then it worked. So that's what led her to conclude that the nanoparticles were present in both. It must be the nanostructures in the water that is actually the active ingredient. And this is the same thing that that Montagnier is saying. Because if you can, okay, yes, you have the signal, but if you can send it over the internet and put it in a tube of water and then just add base pairs and it reforms the DNA, there's no DNA there. There's nothing other than water there. Maybe some other contaminants, but it's got to be water structures. Yeah.
So what we're getting at too, is very important, that fundamentally we're operating on the assumption that what we understand to be particulate is actually more or less the interference pattern. there is no particle.
Well, what the physicists say, these are coherent domains of water. And this is why we have such a hard time discerning this. If this is the active ingredient, you can look at it and you don't see it. You can do an electron microscopy, but they're so small, they're nanometers, so the only way to see them was with an electron microscope. But the problem is, what do you do when you do electron microscopy? You heat it up so you get rid of all the water first, and then you're looking for something that isn't there anymore. But now actually we have a tool to see that, which I'll show you right now. So actually, these are a couple authors here, Konovalov and Ho. They actually have taken pictures of these nanostructures in water. It's just water. And it's only because a new technology was developed called atomic force microscopy that we can see these. So I read that and I was like, what the heck is atomic force microscopy? That sounds pretty cool. But this is what it is. Basically, all it is you have a cantilever. And atomic force microscopy allows you to see things that are less than a nanometer in size. So almost like we're talking atomic level, like 0.1 nanometers. That's one angstrom. So what you do is in an atomic force microscope, you have this cantilever tip which has a little probe on it, and you shoot a laser off of it, and then you collect that information. And then as it moves across the surface, it goes up and down. So if the water has a structure, it's going to go up and down on that structure. So this allows us, this is how they get these pictures. These are all atomic force micrographs. So even though you can't see it, it's not visible to the eyes, the structure's there, and the cantilever sees it, and then you can see it. Now we can see it. Probably somewhat, but something that was previously invisible is now visible. Yes.
They both developed a type of microscopy that's forced and cheap.
Oh, the live cell, the black field, dark field?
That's something that kind of involves pop culture. They both developed very sophisticated, just strictly in an optical sense. There's no electron transmission through that, which basically took light microscopy, so that you could actually view these things in a living condition, a living state. They're alive. You take a biopsy from the cell and actually view the thing that's kind of its natural habitat, so to say, as opposed to these kinds of scanning electron conditions, which are more or less, not only are you doing kind of snapshots, but you're destroying the structures.
Exactly. And this is the reason in medicine, I think, that we're so stuck, is because we're stuck on pathology and histology. But that is, what is it? You take a tissue, you cut it up, you put it formalin, you kill it, and then you stain it, and you see a static structure. We're not seeing the dynamic aspect. So, and it's the same thing with electron microscopy. Okay, you're taking pictures of the nanoparticles, but you're losing the whole water nanostructures. So why don't we look at the dynamic part? It's because it's very hard to see the dynamic part. You have to develop a certain new type of microscopy, a new way of looking.
So, yeah. Tim, when you were saying that it sounds like it's the water nanoparticles, or the water structures that are more important, even more so than the source nanoparticles, right? It
depends what potency you're using. Like here, she says, this is again one of Dr. Pollack's slides, from 1 to 10 to the 4. Let's see. From around 10 to the 4 to 10 to the -6, the nanostructures start to become the dominant factor. So under 10 to the -4, it's the actual nanoparticles themselves, the active ingredient. So it's certain potency. Like that's why, again, like I said, most calendula ointments are 1x, 2x, because you have active calendula in it, part of the plant in it, and that's the active ingredient. But when you get to the higher potencies, there's so few of those that the active ingredient can't be that anymore, if you believe this research. It's the nanostructures that are formed as a result of that.
So that can explain how stuff like soul could work, because there's no particles in it. So it's just basically water structures that are energy of something.
Right. And how the potency, why would they use a 3x soul? Maybe because, again, if they're taking the soul and they're putting it in a gel, after it's already formed, you're going to need to use a low potency, but you probably could use a higher potency if you formed the soul in the water first and then form the gel. So it's all how you form the gel. It's the manufacturing process, too, can influence whether the remedy is active or not, whether the topical application is active. That's what I mean. That was when Dr. Pollack gave us her. I think that was an aha moment for her. It was like, oh, you know, you need the water. The water is necessary. The nanoparticles are not enough. And in fact, I don't have slides on this, but and I was actually talking to Lisa, and so you said Homeopathy Research Institute. If you want to look at some of the studies in homeopathy, there's a great website, Homeopathy Research Institute, hri.org or .com. And so one of the researchers there, he's a physicist or something, and he's gotten into homeopathy, says, well, the nanoparticles can't be it. And he said the reason this is because there's crosstalk between tubes. And in fact, there's one good series of studies that they've looked at one model in homeopathy that's been very reproducible. They've done hundreds and hundreds of studies that reproduced in different labs, where if you take amphibians and you look at their metamorphosis, the rate of metamorphosis, you get them in the two-leg phase, the little tadpoles, and then see how long it takes them to have, you know, for 2 more legs. So they have 4-leg stage. That's the metamorphosis. And if you add thyroxine, T4, to their media, they metamorphose quicker, and it's predictable how much, depending on how much you add. But true to hormesis, if you give a homeopathic dilution of thyroxine, like a 30x, you slow down the metamorphosis. Predictable. Statistically significant rate. There's other ways of doing it where they give an intermittent burst of remedy, they expose to the remedy, and then you stimulate the metamorphosis. So it can go either way. It's a bimodal effect. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. But those researchers, so that's a very reproducible model. I think that's the model they use to determine that, so you can have a reproducible model, and then you expose it to cell phone radiation. And then what you see is the effect is less. So this is because you have a reproducible model, you can take your remedy and expose it to something and see, does it have an effect on the remedy? And I think that's one of the ways that they found out that cell phone radiation can. But one of the experiments they did about this whole crosstalk thing is they took a tube of the thyroxine in a sealed tube and put it in the frog's water and kept it sealed. Didn't drop it in the water, so it interspersed with the water. Kept it in a sealed tube, it still had an effect. It was a little bit less, but it still had an effect. And the type of glass that they used, they said quartz glass was the best. Sometimes lime silicate, some other glass didn't work as well. But the quartz worked better. So again, that's showing that the nanoparticles are there. It's cool that the nanoparticles are there, but it's not the whole story. Not the whole story. And again, this study shows, and this paper is again from 2016. They said, well, because you're making these in glass containers, what about the silica? And in fact, what they showed is that, for example, Nature Mirror, if you make it into a remedy, and they look at the nanoparticles, what you find is in the middle is Nature Mirror. And then here's the electron diffraction. And this is where it was cool. They showed a study where when you do electron diffraction, if you keep doing electron diffraction, the nanoparticle goes like this. The electrons basically sublimated. They heat it up, and it basically turns into gas and goes away. But what they found is that the middle is Nature Mirror, sodium chloride. The exterior is silica. And here you can see, here's the sodium chloride, here's the silica, silicon dioxide, the glass. And the same thing, kalium muriaticum, potassium chloride. The center was potassium chloride, the outside was silica, the silicon dioxide. So it has something to do with water nanostructures. I mean, the mechanism of action of homeopathy, probably, especially for higher potencies, is water nanostructures. And it's interesting, these water nanostructures, I saw mention that you can take that dilution, put it on like pellets of something, and they will remain, even in a dry state. The structure is still there. As long as you don't heat it. If you heat it to a certain temperature, it disperses. If you expose it to microwave radiation, it disperses. Maybe too much X-ray, it disperses. But otherwise, it's very stable.
So but if it has to do with the water structures, how does it get preserved in something totally like anhydrous, like a color sugar?
I don't think anything is totally anhydrous because there's always some water in there, because there's water in the environment, there's water in the atmosphere, so there's a certain steady state.
So there's still,
I mean, you probably understand the physics of that better than me, but everything has some water content.
way that I look at it since I've been coming to my good friend, just about 144, practice. We've talked about this for a long time, and I said to him, I think that we will find as we move forward that water isn't just kind of natural air, natural analogy, it's theoretical concept. And we move from very, very undifferentiated to very differentiated. There's a reason that we have this adage across culture that more or less named water to be responsible for the medium of life. And that's because it had this lattice work, this capacity for storing, modifying, and producing information. It's a creative medium. Why?
You almost get back to the universal. It's like we're trying to get a glimpse of something that's ineffable, but the water is kind of the link.
Of course, what we wonder is right,
Baptism, pouring water.
So I think that it has this electrical, what we said about the quartz crystal. That's another reason why there are so many crystals in the New Age movement, backwards through these Hermetic schools, quartz crystals, and all these different kinds of stones become so apparent because that lattice structure becomes this the point which you differentiate the effect on living systems. Water seems to have all of that.
And one of the people doing a lot of research on this, and Joel, you've read his books, is Gerald Pollack from the University of Washington, Pollack. And he has a YouTube video online. It's called Water, Cells, Life, something like that. It's a lecture that he gave, like a 1-hour lecture. It's really good to watch. And he basically said, you know, his whole thesis is that water, when you expose it to light and a polar substance, it forms easy water. It forms exclusion zone water where the water molecules, the dipoles line up. And they form basically like a crystal. But it's at room temperature. And all you need is ambient light and a polar something that's in touch with. And his supposition is that inside cells, most of the water is actually structured water. It's not just random water. In physics, in biology, random water, and you throw a molecule in it, and it eventually goes, and we still can't explain how that happens. So so in this talk, sort of toward the end, he talks about, well, how did life form in the first place? Because you had to have these complex molecules, these proteins, this DNA. How did it form out of just random molecules? And he said, one of the ways it could have happened is with this easy water, this exclusion zone or fourth phase of water, this liquid crystal water would provide a template for that, an area for these molecules to get together. And if you look at this research on the nanions and the water nanostructures, it's forming, or the double helix structure, it's forming the structure there that pre-existed, and then the DNA just formed around it. I mean, it's one way of understanding how life could have formed. So it really makes you wonder, is it the other, which is necessary for life? It's like you need those organic molecules there, but it's like water you need too. It's like you need both. It's interesting. Which brings me to my conclusion is, and I just gave this talk on Wednesday, and Adrian was there, and he gave me an interesting book on water and what water we should drink. I think it's very fascinating. It's like we're actually 70% water. Our bodies are 70% water. And as we age, you contract 70 to 80% water. Baby is even more. As we age, the percentage of water goes down. It's like less water equals your senescence and death. Dehydration is like bad. There's an author from the Middle East, Saudi Arabian doctor called Dr. Patmanjali. He wrote a whole book, The Body's Many Cries for Water. He talks about all these different diseases that are just treated by giving water, by giving hydration to people. But what do you think is, now this is, I'm just throwing out because I don't know the answer. I mean, most of these things we're just presenting things that's very interesting. It's like, what's the real meaning? What is the best water to use? Now I use, in the office I've traditionally used reverse osmosis. We all know that tap water is probably not a good idea to drink because of the chlorine, because of the fluoride, because of the drugs. The question is, what is a good form of water to drink?
I follow one of the early people that I've read on the subject is a man called Victor Schauberger, who's a well-known Austrian woodsman, engineer, had all of these theories and based the entirety of that technology. what was assumed by the Nazi situation. His entire concept of water was that he had a very early concept of this lattice structure of water. He says it very clearly, and it forms from vortices. In other words, he assumed that the nuclear atom, what we call the atom itself today, is actually a vortice, a standing wave of fluid.
Well, then you get back to the ether theory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that when you put
which is exactly what the physicists are saying now, because when you get into, so you have lowest, smallest part, electron, proton, neutron, but what are they made out of? They're made out of quarks. All these top, downs, this, strange, blah, blah, blah. But what are those? It's a vibration.
The waves. And the wave, and then what I was referring to is multiplicities and manifolds, that as these waves become in some way harmonically relevant to one another, they start to add together and form this infinite gradient substructure of multiple reflections of these manifolds are the differentiation of all substance to gas substance. The Schauberger basically came up with this idea that you could charge water in this way by actually exposing it to this natural vortice. So he would actually develop these devices that were made out of copper primarily. This copper encoded this atmospheric character that is identified in all metals, amplified this process and imparted this ordering process on water. So you actually had this device that spun the water in a tornado in a log spiral. So it started very big, gets very small. It's exactly the same equation that you just showed, y equals ax to the negative n, except there's a negative. That's the original equation that Leibniz derives in calculus.
Really?
That is both the integral and the differential.
It's like a parabolic curve.
Yes.
That's a parabola, right?
That is a non-linear system. That's the very early workings. His fractal differentiation work, that is the equation that he uses. His is y equals x to the n. Its own right. And more or less establishing that this analogical relationship in this common language is just between very, very small and very, very large. There's no other way to see it. That's what the calculus was originally meant to be, and then along came non-static analysis, and they instituted this concept of a limit, which makes everything asymptotically approach something that we can't really ever have truth. We can't really ever have. It's a nihilistic.
Right, right. You approach it, but you never get there.
No, but Leibniz never wanted that. He wrote his methodology, which is a very specific kind of etheric kind of idea, and then he stacked his calculus on top of it. They were meant to go together. And got kind of rearranged. So, but it's the same thing. So anyway, Schauberger, this log spiral device in a centripetal, and then there's a differentiation between centripetal and centrifugal spin characters. So one produces atomic forces, combustive forces, mechanical heat, radiative forces. One actually produces the opposite, which is negentropy or centropy. It actually cools the water almost instantaneously by 4 degrees. And when you drink this, it seems to him that life seems to benefit from that. And then there has been a whole slew of water filtration systems that are designed upon that idea. And those are the ones that I think that are probably in principle the best, if they work or not. Because I bought one, tested it.
Which one did you get?
I got one made by a guy called Dan Mitchell. He's another one of these likes to pass other people's ideas off.
So what kind of water do you drink?
I buy a water, it's called New Zealand water. It comes in a non-polymer bag. And then I put that through the filtration system.
What type of filtration system?
I have reverse osmosis. But it is supposedly supposed to be this kind of impulsive situation. It's called developed by a guy called Nanoparticles. So just plug it right into the sink. We currently live in an apartment, so it's a little bit. There's another good one. I forget what it's called. I can. Let's just know what I add to it.
I think the water question should be turned around. The energy of life is a lot stronger than the energy of the water. And for all the right remedy to do it, takes some little thing that makes it big, which is resonates with the body. So within limits, of course, we want all the pollutants out of the water, but we change the water. So we're the stronger force, not the water. But within limits. So there's no right water, just like there's no right remedy for everybody.
The other question I had was, is there anything magical about sucrose or lactose for tablets? Or has anybody ever tried to potentize salt pellets or something else? Does it work?
Silica, what's his name up in the suburbs? Francine knows it. Great.
Oh, sure.
Oh, Ishwa, yeah.
Much to do with silica-based.
Has anybody ever tried salt pellets or silica pellets? I mean, you would think that somebody along the line scientifically would have said, well, you know, as long as what's magical about sugar pellets, can we try it with salt, let's try it with potassium chloride, or let's try it with the other ones. I mean, if it really, do you think it would work in other things? I mean, I assume
the way
that,
that I view things, it would have to work to some degree.
I'm assuming the only reason Hahnemann used that was probably because confectionaries were all around the place and anybody could make sugar pellets and it was a common thing.
And you can get it pure. You can get it pretty pure.
But I'm sure if I had pure salt.
And they still use lactose, I believe, in nanopharmacology to disperse the pellets. When you put the liquid on it disperses the pellets and it stabilizes them. So in homeopathy, that's kind of what we do. We have a liquid dilution, but the liquid dilution, if you let it sit in your drawer too long, it evaporates, and then who knows what you have. You put it on pellets. I mean, the Dunham potencies, which we probably all use, 150 years old. They've been grafted a zillion times. They still work. So it's whatever's there. Once it's there on the pellet, it's very stable.
You mentioned that. What is on the pellet?
That basically, when in nanopharmacology, they use like I think lactose pellets, lactose as a dispersant of the nanoparticles, so stabilizer and dispersant, something like that.
But I mean, when the remedy's dry, 40 years or more, what's there to keep the structure stable?
I think the water nanostructures are stable.
Still there on the dry.
Yep. Yeah. I'd have to look that up.
That could be a reason why dry grafting works.
Yeah, it's just it's obviously there's some solubilization. If it's a nanoparticle, it tends to soluble. It goes into the air, whatever. That's why olfaction works. But yeah.
Of course, that's the next step. Talking about liquid preparation, but most of the time we use totally dry remedy.
That's right.
So that concept is wrong. Totally
No, I mean every sugar has some hydration too. Has some hydration molecules with it.
So is there anything ethically that I'm missing between, because if you can transfer these substructures into another fluid, another vial of water that's displaced from the carrier, then I can't think of any reason why you simply couldn't use homeopathic tests. There would be no oral introduction of anything. You have your homeopathic remedy, you have whether your potency is for the person. You've got a flat Tesla pendulum. It's grounded into.
This is what the people who do the Rife machine, Rife or what is it called? The little box. Well, that's for measuring the signal, but I guess they also. But basically, they create a remedy out of just an electromagnetic signal.
It's not with Rife. With Rife, because it's passing through noble gas and argon gas, it goes through a process called phase conjugation. It comes in electromagnetic, but it comes out the other side. It's not. It's a Tesla. It's actually a Tesla. It's not electron. It's a longitudinal. Scalar
wave or something.
Yeah, kind of like that.
Yeah.
But
originally, it was Abrams.
Yeah, Abrams. Oh, yeah. Well, it's radionics.
Radionics, yeah. Grimmer used to use that for treating his patients, but I mean we don't. It's interesting. The FDA views if you have a device like that and you're making medicines that you can get into trouble because you're creating a medical. It's a medical device. It becomes a medical device because you're making medicines. That's why we buy. We still buy the pellets from the manufacturer. Although sometimes we have to graft.
So that's why brain tuning and more electrification. We have a lot of success up into 90 to 110 microampere reads on wrist need. So if you build it yourself and you say it's for research purposes, you have to be. But if you don't build it yourself, you buy it and start.
And the problem, that's when the FDA jumps in and says, oh, you can't do that.
Oh, so what you were saying about keeping your cell phones away from your pelletized remedies because it can mess them up, but if it's really so stable in the pellets, has anybody else found that to be true? That if you have your cell phone stored in the same box as your remedies, has anybody else found that the remedies get less potent without working?
I wouldn't have known because for a while I used to keep my phone in my purse and I carried a bunch of remedies in my purse and I never noticed them not working. But
so in your experience, it definitely decreases their efficacy? I
just know the one study, there's one study where they looked at that. In Andre's Essential course, he gives you the article. I could look it up. But they actually studied that, and in fact, it did have an effect. It didn't totally negate the effect of the remedy, but it diminished the effectiveness of the remedy. But again, you have to have a reproducible model, so you know, okay, this remedy will have this effect. It has to be reproducible, like in the metamorphosis study. And then you affect the remedy and see how much of an effect it has. And it doesn't totally negate it, but it somewhat negates it. So it's stable, but as you'd expect, if it's kind of a physiochemical thing, you'd expect certain things to affect it. I mean, that just makes sense. All right.
Thanks for the update. It's always good to count on you to give us the latest updates. So it's very helpful.
Tim, would you like just the board members or